Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Picture a fortress that does not merely sit upon the land but seems to float upon the sea, a citadel of such audacious design that its walls rise directly from the waves, their foundations sunk into the bedrock of a promontory that has defied the storms of the Mediterranean for millennia, a place where the sea itself becomes a moat and the horizon is guarded by the watchful eyes of warrior monks. This is Château Pèlerin, the castle of the pilgrim, known today as the ruin of Atlit, a name that echoes with the memory of the thousands of faithful who dug its foundations with their own hands and who believed that the fortress was a gift from God, a tangible sign of his favor bestowed upon the soldiers of the cross. The castle was built on a rocky spit of land that jutted into the sea some 20 kilometers south of Haifa, a natural promontory that had served as a harbor since the days when the ships of Tyre and Sidon plied the waters of the ancient world, their cargoes of timber, oil, and purple dye enriching the Canaanite and Phoenician merchants who were the first to recognize the strategic value of this place. The Templars, with their infallible eye for strategic terrain and their deep understanding of the interplay between land and sea that was essential to the survival of the Crusader states, recognized that here was a site of almost supernatural defensive potential, a promontory that could be transformed into an island fortress. Connected to the mainland by a single narrow neck of rock that could be cut and flooded at the will of the defenders. The promontory was cut off from the mainland by a deep fosse carved through solid rock, a moat that was filled with seawater by a system of sluice gates that harnessed the very tides, turning the castle into an island that was accessible only by a drawbridge that could be raised or destroyed in a matter of minutes, and the fosse itself was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering that was the equal of any Roman aqueduct. The walls that rose from this island were built of stones so massive that they seemed to have been quarried by the titans of Greek legend, blocks of limestone measuring nearly 5 meters in length and weighing over 20 tons, stones that were fitted with a precision that left gaps no wider than a knife blade, their surfaces dressed to a smooth, glassy finish that deflected the projectiles of the enemy, and that resisted the erosion of the salt spray and the winter storms. The Muslim armies that confronted Château Pèlerin, the hosts of the Ayyubid and Mamluk sultanates that had shattered the walls of every other Crusader fortress, gazed upon these walls and despaired, for they knew that no trebuchet ever built could breach them, and no sapper could mine beneath the sea that surrounded the castle on 3 sides. The Mamluk chroniclers, who recorded the victories and the defeats of the sultans with a meticulous attention to detail, wrote of Château Pèlerin as a fortress that was protected by magic, for the stones were too large to have been lifted by human hands, and the harbor that opened and closed at the will of the defenders was a defiance of the natural order that could only be the work of sorcery. The Templars, who understood the power of such legends and who cultivated them with a deliberate care, did nothing to dispel the stories, knowing that an enemy who believed the fortress was invincible was an enemy who was already half defeated, his morale sapped by the conviction that he was fighting not merely against men but against forces that were beyond the natural order. Château Pèlerin was the only Templar castle that was never captured by storm, the only fortress that remained inviolate until the very end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, and its story is the story of the Templar genius at its most audacious and its most triumphant. A story that begins with the Fifth Crusade and that ends with the smoke of the burning buildings rising into the sky as the last ships sailed away to Cyprus. The origins of Château Pèlerin lie in the Fifth Crusade, that great and ill-fated expedition that sought to conquer Egypt as the key to recovering Jerusalem, and that ended in defeat on the banks of the Nile in 1221. The Crusaders who had come from every corner of Europe having poured their treasure and their blood into the sands of the Delta, and having returned to the Holy Land with little to show for their sacrifice but the bones of their fallen comrades and the bitter memory of what might have been. Yet the Fifth Crusade was not entirely fruitless, for it was during the campaign of 1218 that the Templars, under the visionary leadership of the Grand Master Guillaume de Chartres, began the construction of a fortress that would become the most formidable in the entire Crusader East. A fortress that would serve as the ultimate refuge for the order in the decades of crisis that lay ahead. The site on the coast south of Haifa was chosen for its natural advantages, the promontory that provided a sheltered harbor on its seaward side and that was cut off from the mainland by a narrow neck of land that could be easily fortified, and the Grand Master, who had seen the vulnerability of the inland castles to the mining and the bombardment of the Muslim armies. Determined to build a fortress that could be supplied by the sea and that could never be starved into surrender. The Crusaders who had come to the Holy Land to fight for the cross, and who were eager to leave a permanent mark on the land they had sworn to defend, were invited to participate in the construction, to dig the foundations and to carry the stones with their own hands, earning the spiritual merit that was the reward of the pilgrim, and thousands of them responded to the call. Their labor transforming the rocky promontory into a fortress that would bear their name, Château Pèlerin, the Castle of the Pilgrim. The strategic location of Château Pèlerin was the product of a careful analysis of the coastal geography of the Holy Land, an analysis that had been conducted by the Templar engineers over the preceding decades, and that had identified the promontory of Atlit as the ideal site for a coastal fortress that could serve as the linchpin of the Templar defensive network. The promontory, which extended some 300 meters into the Mediterranean, was composed of a hard, fossil-rich limestone that provided an excellent foundation for the walls, its strata sloping gently downward from the landward side to the sea, and its surface was large enough to accommodate a fortress of the first rank without requiring the extensive leveling that had been necessary at Safed. The seaward side of the promontory was bounded by a natural harbor, a sheltered bay that was protected from the prevailing winds by the curve of the rock and that had been used as an anchorage since the Bronze Age, when the first merchants had sailed this coast with their cargoes of timber and oil from the forests of Lebanon and the presses of the coastal plain. The landward side of the promontory was connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of rock, a natural causeway that was less than 100 meters wide at its narrowest point, and it was this neck that the Templar engineers would cut with their fosse, transforming the promontory into an island that was accessible only by a bridge that could be destroyed at a moment's notice. The fosse being the first and most formidable of the castle's defenses. The location of Château Pèlerin was a gift of nature, a site that seemed to have been designed by the Creator for the purpose of fortification, but it was a gift that only the most skilled engineers could exploit, and the Templars, who had been studying the terrain of the Holy Land for over a century and who had built castles on mountains, on rivers, and on the edges of the desert, were the masters of the art. The design of Château Pèlerin was a radical departure from the concentric plans of the inland fortresses, a departure that was dictated by the unique character of the site and by the specific threats that a coastal fortress faced, threats that included not only the siege engines of the Muslim armies but also the storms of the Mediterranean and the raids of the enemy's ships. Unlike Safed, which was a circular fortress built around the summit of a mountain and which relied on its concentric walls and its talus to resist the enemy, Château Pèlerin was a rectangular fortress that followed the contours of the promontory, its walls tracing the edge of the rock and its towers positioned to command the approaches from the sea as well as the land. The entire design being a response to the specific topography of the site. The fortress was divided into 3 wards, each separated from the next by a massive wall and a rock-cut ditch that could be flooded with seawater, the wards rising in terraces from the outer wall on the landward side to the great keep on the seaward tip of the promontory, a progression that allowed the defenders to fall back from one line to the next, each line stronger than the one before it. The outer ward, which was the first line of defense, contained the stables, the barracks, the workshops, and the great cisterns that collected the winter rains, and it was protected by a wall that was over 15 meters thick at its base, a wall that was constructed of the Cyclopean stones that were the hallmark of the fortress, stones that were so massive that they seemed to have been set in place by a race of giants. The middle ward, which was the administrative center of the castle, contained the great hall where the commander held his court, the chapel where the brothers gathered for the daily round of prayer, the treasury where the gold and the silver of the order were stored, and the archive where the records and the secrets of the temple were kept under constant guard. The inner ward, which was the final refuge and the ultimate redoubt, contained the keep, a massive tower that rose from the highest point of the promontory and that commanded a view of the entire fortress and the sea beyond, a tower that was the last line of defense for the garrison and the treasure that they guarded. The walls of Château Pèlerin were the most formidable ever constructed by the Templars, a feat of engineering that was the equal of the great walls of Constantinople and that surpassed any fortress in the Latin West, and their construction required the mobilization of the entire Templar organization in the Holy Land and the participation of the thousands of crusaders who had come with the Fifth Crusade. The stones that were used in the construction of the outer wall were quarried from the promontory itself, the limestone being cut from the living rock by teams of masons working under the direction of the Templar engineers. And the blocks were of a size that was unprecedented in the Crusader period, some of them measuring nearly 5 meters in length and weighing over 20 tons. Their extraction requiring the use of iron wedges and sledgehammers, and their transportation requiring the construction of special roads and sleds. The lifting of these blocks into place was accomplished by the treadwheel cranes that were the largest lifting machines of the medieval world, cranes that were erected on the rising walls and that were powered by the weight of the men who walked within their great wooden wheels. The entire operation being a ballet of human and mechanical power that was directed by master riggers who used hand signals and shouted commands. The precision with which the blocks were fitted was such that the joints between them were almost invisible, a precision that was achieved by the master masons who had been trained in the Templar workshops, and who had learned the secrets of the craft from the masters who had built the great cathedrals of Europe, and the mortar that bonded the stones together was a secret mixture that hardened to a stone-like consistency, a mixture that was the product of the Templar study of the construction techniques of the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Arabs. The walls of Château Pèlerin were designed to withstand the most powerful siege weapons of the age, and they succeeded, for the fortress was never breached by the engines of the enemy, its walls standing firm against the trebuchets of the Ayyubids and the Mamluks. The fosse that cut off the promontory from the mainland was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, a moat that was carved through solid rock to a depth of over 10 meters and a width of over 20 meters, and that was filled with seawater by a system of sluice gates that harnessed the power of the tides, the gates being operated from within the castle by a mechanism that was a closely guarded secret of the order. The fosse was not merely a static barrier but a dynamic defense that could be adjusted at will, the water level being raised or lowered to accommodate the tides and the seasons, and the sluice gates themselves were constructed of massive timbers of Lebanese cedar, bound with iron bands and faced with copper plates that resisted the corrosion of the salt water, the gates being set in grooves that were cut into the solid rock of the fosse. The fosse served multiple purposes in the defense of the castle. It prevented the approach of siege towers and battering rams, for no engine could be brought across the water-filled ditch. It made mining impossible, because any tunnel that was dug beneath the fosse would immediately flood, drowning the sappers in their own excavation, and it isolated the castle from the mainland, turning it into an island that could only be reached by the drawbridge that was protected by the barbican. The fosse was also stocked with fish, which provided a source of fresh food for the garrison during a siege, and its waters were a mirror that reflected the walls of the castle, creating the illusion that the fortress was floating on the sea, an illusion that the Muslim chroniclers describe as the work of magic and that added to the psychological terror that the fortress inspired. The harbor of Château Pèlerin was the secret of the castle's invincibility, for it provided a supply line that could never be cut by the enemy, a lifeline that connected the fortress to the outside world and that rendered the siege tactics of the Muslim armies utterly useless. The harbor was located on the seaward side of the promontory, sheltered from the prevailing winds by the curve of the rock, and it was protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the entrance, the chain being controlled by winches within the keep and being raised or lowered to admit friendly ships or to bar enemy galleys, a barrier that was the ultimate guarantee of the fortress's supply. The chain itself was a marvel of medieval metallurgy, a series of iron links that were forged in the Templar workshops, each link weighing over 50 kilograms and being connected to the next by a massive iron pin that was secured with a cotter, the entire chain being over 100 meters in length and weighing many tons, its strength being such that no ship could break it. The harbor was large enough to accommodate a squadron of Templar war galleys and a fleet of supply vessels, and the quays that were carved into the rock were equipped with the cranes and the warehouses that were needed for the unloading of the cargoes, the grain and the wine and the weapons that sustained the garrison through the long years of the Mamluk siege. The Templar fleet, which was based at Château Pèlerin and at the other coastal fortresses, maintained a continuous shuttle of supply vessels that brought grain from the Templar estates in Cyprus, wine from the vineyards of the Aegean, iron and steel from the workshops of Lombardy, and the gold and the silver that were the lifeblood of the order's banking operations. the fleet being the most powerful naval force in the eastern Mediterranean and the guarantor of the Crusaders' survival. The garrison of Château Pèlerin was a microcosm of the Templar order, a community of knights, sergeants, Turco-Poles, and lay brothers who lived and worked and prayed within the walls of the sea fortress, their lives governed by the same iron rule that regulated every Templar preceptory from the great temple in Jerusalem to the humblest commandery in the English countryside. The knights, who were the elite of the garrison and who were drawn from the noble families of Europe, were the heavy cavalry that was the striking arm of the fortress, their war horses stabled in the outer ward and their swords and lances stored in the armory, and their white mantles with the red cross were the visible symbol of their dedication to the defense of the Holy Land. The sergeants, who were the non-noble members of the order and who served as the crossbowmen, the gate guards, and the support troops, were the backbone of the garrison, their discipline and their training being the equal of the knights, and their crossbows sweeping the approaches with a rain of quarrels that no attacker could survive. The Turco-Poles, who were the local Christian light cavalry and who spoke Arabic as their native tongue, were the eyes and ears of the garrison, their patrols riding the circuit of the coastal plain and providing the early warning of any enemy movement, their knowledge of the terrain and their fluency in Arabic making them invaluable as scouts and as spies. The garrison of Château Pèlerin was a brotherhood, a fellowship of men who had pledged their lives to the defense of the fortress and to the service of the order, and their morale was sustained by the knowledge that their castle had never been taken, that their walls were the strongest in the Holy Land, and that their harbor was the lifeline that could never be cut. A knowledge that gave them a quiet confidence that was the foundation of their resilience. The daily life of the garrison was a rhythm of prayer, work, and vigilance that was timed to the canonical hours of the monastic day and to the tides that governed the access to the harbor, a rhythm that was as unchanging as the rise and the set of the sun, and that was the foundation of the Templar discipline. The brothers rose at midnight for the office of matins, the most demanding of the monastic hours, and they gathered in the chapel, their white mantles visible in the candlelight, their voices rising in the Gregorian chant that had been sung by the monks of the desert and the cathedrals of Europe, the chant echoing through the vaulted space and drifting out across the harbor to the ships that lay at anchor. The sailors crossing themselves and murmuring a prayer of their own. They prayed again at dawn, the office of lauds, giving thanks for the return of the light that revealed the enemy's positions on the mainland and the state of the sea that would determine the day's operations, the morning watch being the time when the sentries were changed and the patrols were dispatched to sweep the coastal plain. The day was spent in the duties that were assigned by the commander and his officers, the knights and the sergeants taking their turns on the walls, in the towers, and on the patrols, their crossbows always loaded and their eyes always scanning the horizon for the telltale dust cloud that would signal the approach of an army, and the Turco-Poles riding the circuit of the hills and the wadis, their dark cloaks blending into the shadows of the landscape. The discipline of the garrison was absolute, enforced by the commander and his officers with a rigor that was unique in the medieval world, and the brothers accepted the discipline as a part of their vocation, a discipline that was the foundation of their military effectiveness and the source of their resilience in the face of the siege that they knew would one day come. The psychological impact of Château Pèlerin on the Muslim armies that confronted it was a weapon that the Templars cultivated with the same care that they brought to the maintenance of the walls, for the fortress was designed not only to resist the enemy but to intimidate him, to break his will before the battle had even begun. The sight of the castle, rising from the sea on its rocky promontory, its walls gleaming white in the sun and its towers reflecting the light like the facets of a jewel, was a vision that was intended to inspire awe and despair in equal measure, a vision that said to the attacker, "You cannot take this place, you cannot starve it, you cannot mine it, you can only pass it by and hope that it does not destroy you." The Muslim chroniclers, who were not given to hyperbole, described Château Pèlerin as a fortress that had been built by magic, for the stones were too large to have been lifted by human hands, and the walls were too smooth to have been shaped by human tools, and the harbor that opened and closed at the will of the defenders was a defiance of the natural order that could only be the work of sorcery. The Templars did nothing to dispel these legends. On the contrary, they cultivated them, understanding that an enemy who believed that the fortress was invincible was an enemy who was already half defeated, and the garrison of Château Pèlerin watched with a quiet satisfaction as the Mamluk armies marched past the promontory on their way to the siege of Acre, knowing that their castle would never be taken. The psychological warfare that was waged from the walls of Château Pèlerin was a silent campaign that complemented the physical defenses, and it was a campaign that was entirely successful, for the fortress was never assaulted with the full force of the Mamluk army, the Sultan preferring to bypass it rather than to waste his soldiers on walls that could not be breached. The construction of Château Pèlerin was a project of such scale and ambition that it required the mobilization of the entire Templar organization in the Holy Land and the participation of the thousands of crusaders who had come with the Fifth Crusade. A project that was the largest military construction program of the Crusader period and that consumed the revenues of half the Templar preceptories in Europe for several years. The Grand Master, Guillaume de Chartres, who had been elected to the leadership of the order in 1210 and who was a man of immense energy and vision, was the driving force behind the project, a leader who had recognized the vulnerability of the inland castles to the mining and the bombardment of the Muslim armies and who was determined to build a fortress that could serve as the ultimate refuge for the order in the east. A fortress that could never be starved into surrender, and that could protect the treasury and the archive that were the lifeblood of the temple. The work began in 1218, while the Crusader army was still engaged in the siege of Damietta in Egypt, and the Grand Master, who had returned to the Holy Land to oversee the construction personally, threw the full resources of the order into the project, diverting the revenues of the European preceptories and the donations of the faithful to the quarrying and the transportation of the stone, the hiring of the masons and the laborers, and the construction of the roads and the cranes that were needed for the work. The Crusaders who had remained in the Holy Land, the knights and the barons who had not accompanied the army to Egypt and who were eager to earn the spiritual merit that was the reward of the pilgrim, were invited to participate in the construction, to dig the foundations and to carry the stones with their own hands, and thousands responded to the call, their labor transforming the rocky promontory into the foundations of the fortress that would bear their name. The construction of Château Pèlerin was a communal endeavor, a work of faith that united the Templars, the Crusaders, and the local Christian population in a common cause. And the speed with which the fortress rose from the rock was a testament to the dedication and the organization of the builders, the outer wall being completed within a few years of the foundation being laid. The quarrying of the stone for the walls of Château Pèlerin was an operation that was conducted on the promontory itself, the limestone being cut from the living rock that formed the core of the spit, and the quarrying operation was so extensive that it altered the shape of the promontory, creating the sheer cliffs that added to the natural defenses of the site, and that provided the stone for the cyclopean walls of the outer enceinte. The limestone of Atlit, a hard, fossil-rich stone that was the product of the ancient seabed that had been lifted from the water by the geological forces that had shaped the coast, was an ideal building material, its density and its durability being the equal of the basalt that the Templars had used at Safed, and its light color reflecting the sun and giving the fortress its distinctive, gleaming appearance. The masons who cut the stone were the elite of their profession, men who had been trained in the workshops of the temple and who had learned the secrets of the craft from the masters who had built the great cathedrals of Europe, and they worked with a precision that still astonishes the modern observer, the blocks being cut to a tolerance that is measured in millimeters, their surfaces dressed to a smooth, glassy finish that defied the chisel and the hammer. The largest blocks, the cyclopean stones that were the signature of the fortress, were cut from the lower strata of the quarry, the beds of limestone that were free of the fissures and the faults that could cause a block to crack during the lifting or the setting, and their extraction required the use of iron wedges and sledgehammers, the wedges being driven into the natural fissures or into slots that had been cut with a pick. The hammer blows ringing across the promontory from dawn to dusk. The transportation of these blocks, some of which weighed over 20 tons, was a feat of logistics that required the construction of a special road from the quarry to the building site, a road that was paved with stone to reduce the friction and that was wide enough to accommodate the ox-drawn sleds that carried the blocks, and the road was graded to a gentle slope that allowed the teams of oxen to pull the loads without excessive strain. The animals being the largest and the strongest that could be obtained from the farms of the coastal plain. The lifting of the massive stones into place was accomplished by the treadwheel cranes that were the largest lifting machines of the medieval world, cranes that were erected on the rising walls and that were powered by the weight of the men who walked within their great wooden wheels. their footsteps providing the energy that was transmitted through a system of ropes and pulleys to the stone that was being lifted. The treadwheel crane, which had been used in the construction of the great cathedrals of Europe, was a device of remarkable efficiency, capable of lifting a stone weighing several tons to a height of over 30 meters with a team of a dozen men, and the Templars installed these cranes at strategic points around the construction site, their wooden frames rising above the walls like the masts of a fleet of ships. The creaking of the wheels and the shouts of the riggers providing the constant soundtrack of the work. The ropes that lifted the stones were made of the finest hemp, imported from the workshops of Venice and Genoa, and they were inspected daily for signs of wear. For the safety of the operation depended on the integrity of the ropes, a single broken strand being a warning that the rope must be replaced. The pulleys and the winches were forged from the iron that was produced in the Templar workshops, the iron being of a quality that was the envy of the secular lords, and the entire lifting system was a triumph of medieval mechanical engineering, a system that was the product of generations of experimentation and refinement. The stones were set in place by the masons, who used iron levers and wooden wedges to adjust the fit, the blocks being lowered onto a bed of the secret mortar. That was the Templar invention, and the precision of the fitting was such that a knife blade could not be inserted between the stones, the entire wall being a single, monolithic structure. The design of the outer wall was a radical innovation in fortress architecture, a design that was dictated by the unique conditions of the site and by the specific threats that a coastal fortress faced, including not only the bombardment of the trebuchets but also the erosion of the sea and the attacks of the enemy's ships, and it was a design that was never replicated in any other Templar castle, making Château Pèlerin a unique monument of military engineering. The outer wall, which was the first line of defense, and which faced the landward side of the promontory, was constructed of the Cyclopean stones that were the signature of the fortress, blocks of limestone that were laid in courses that were bonded with the mortar of the Templar secret, and the wall was over 15 meters thick at its base. A thickness that was necessary to resist the battering of the storm waves that crashed against the promontory during the winter months and the impact of the trebuchet stones that were hurled by the enemy. The wall was protected by a massive talus, the sloped, polished surface that was the signature of Templar fortification, and the talus extended outward from the base of the wall by a distance of over 10 meters, its surface dressed to a smoothness that deflected the stones of the trebuchets, and that made the scaling ladder useless, the ladder sliding down the smooth slope and the attackers falling to their deaths on the rocks below. The wall was punctuated by round towers at regular intervals, each tower designed to provide enfilading fire along the curtain, the arrow loops in the towers being positioned at multiple levels to create a three-dimensional field of fire that no attacker could escape, and the towers were equipped with their own wells and their own stores of provisions, so that they could continue the fight even if the outer wall was breached. The towers becoming independent strongpoints that the attacker would have to reduce one by one. The outer wall of Château Pèlerin was the strongest of any Templar fortress, and it was never breached in the entire history of the castle, its Cyclopean stones standing firm against the fury of the enemy and the elements. The fosse that separated the promontory from the mainland was a work of engineering that was as impressive as the walls themselves, a moat that was carved through solid rock to a depth of over 10 meters and a width of over 20 meters, and that was filled with seawater by a system of sluice gates that was a masterpiece of hydraulic design. A system that the Templar engineers had developed through their study of the Roman and Byzantine waterworks that still dotted the landscape of the Holy Land. The sluice gates, which were built into the masonry of the fosse at the point where it met the sea, were operated by a mechanism that was located within the outer wall, a system of winches and counterweights that allowed a single sergeant to raise or lower the gates and to control the water level within the fosse, the gates being open to admit the sea during the high tide and closed to retain the water during the low tide, maintaining a constant depth that was an impassable barrier to the enemy. The gates themselves were constructed of massive timbers of Lebanese cedar, the wood that had been used for the ships of the Phoenicians and the Temple of Solomon, bound with iron bands and faced with copper plates that resisted the corrosion of the salt water, and they were set in grooves that were cut into the solid rock, the grooves being protected by the towers that flanked the entrance. The fosse served multiple functions in the defense of the castle. It prevented the approach of siege towers and battering rams, for no engine could be brought across the water-filled ditch. It made mining impossible, for any tunnel that was dug beneath the fosse would immediately flood, drowning the sappers in their own excavation, and it isolated the castle from the mainland, turning it into an island that could only be reached by the drawbridge, which was itself protected by the barbican. The fosse was a barrier that no enemy could cross, and its design was a testament to the Templar understanding of the power of water as a defensive weapon, a power that they had harnessed with a skill that was unmatched in the medieval world. The barbican that protected the landward entrance to Château Pèlerin was the most sophisticated gate defense of any Templar fortress, a multi-layered system that transformed the entrance into a death trap from which no attacker could escape, and its design incorporated every lesson that the Order had learned in the sieges of the preceding century, from the barbicans of Safed and the bent entrances of the inland castles. The barbican was a walled enclosure that projected outward from the outer wall, its own gate offset from the main gate so that a charging enemy would crash into a solid wall of stone and be forced to turn, exposing his flank to the fire of the defenders on the walls above, the crossbow bolts striking the attackers in the side where their shields offered no protection. The bolts piercing the chainmail and the flesh with a sound that was the last thing many of them ever heard. The passage through the barbican was narrow, lined with murder holes and arrow loops, and the floor of the passage was sloped downward toward the entrance, so that the boiling water, the heated sand, and the Greek fire that were poured from the murder holes would flow toward the attackers, carrying with them the bodies of the dead and creating a slippery, burning tide that made the passage a vision of hell. The barbican was entered across the drawbridge that spanned the fosse, a bridge that could be raised or destroyed at a moment's notice, and the bridge was protected by a portcullis and a pair of massive iron-bound doors that were backed by a series of bars and bolts that were operated from within the gatehouse, the entire system being a succession of obstacles that the attacker had to overcome in turn, each obstacle exacting a toll in blood. The barbican of Château Pèlerin was never forced, for no attacker could survive the passage through the killing zone, and its design was the culmination of a century of Templar experimentation with the art of gate defense, a design that was the most advanced of the medieval world. The harbor of Château Pèlerin was the key to the castle's strategic value, for it provided a supply line that could never be cut by the enemy, a lifeline that connected the fortress to the sea and that rendered the siege tactics of the Muslim armies useless, the harbor being the mouth through which the nourishment that sustained the garrison flowed, and its existence was the reason that the Mamluk besiegers, who had no fleet capable of challenging the Templar ships, could only watch as the supply vessels entered and left the harbor at will. The harbor was located on the seaward side of the promontory, sheltered from the prevailing winds by the curve of the rock, and it was protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the entrance, the chain being controlled by winches within the keep and being raised or lowered to admit friendly ships or to bar enemy galleys, the chain being the ultimate guarantee of the fortress's supply. The chain itself was a marvel of medieval metallurgy, a series of iron links that were forged in the Templar workshops, each link weighing over 50 kilograms and being connected to the next by a massive iron pin, and the total length of the chain was over 100 meters, sufficient to span the entrance of the harbor with a barrier that no ship could break. The chain being a physical and a psychological obstacle that declared the harbor closed to the enemy. The harbor was large enough to accommodate a squadron of Templar war galleys and a fleet of supply vessels, and the quays that were carved into the rock were equipped with the cranes and the warehouses that were needed for the unloading of the cargoes, the grain and the wine and the weapons that sustained the garrison through the long years of the siege, and the harbor was the scene of the continuous labor of the loading and the unloading, the brother sailors and the lay brothers working in shifts to keep the supplies flowing. The water supply of Château Pèlerin was a feat of engineering that was the equal of the systems that the Templars had built at Safed and at the other inland fortresses, a system that collected and stored the rainwater that fell on the promontory, and that provided the garrison with the water that was essential to its survival, for the castle had no natural spring, the promontory being a mass of limestone that was porous and that held no groundwater. The Templar engineers, who had studied the hydrology of the coastal regions and who had learned the secrets of the Roman and Byzantine cisterns, constructed a system of massive cisterns that were carved into the bedrock beneath the inner ward, the cisterns being lined with the waterproof cement that was the secret of the order, a cement that was capable of holding water without leakage for centuries. The cisterns were fed by a network of channels that collected rainwater from every roof, courtyard, and paved surface within the castle, the entire surface of the fortress being a catchment area that directed the winter rains into the underground chambers, and the water was filtered as it entered the cisterns, passing through settling chambers where the sediment and the debris were allowed to sink to the bottom. The clear water being drawn from the top of the cistern while the sediment accumulated below. The total capacity of the cisterns was over 1 million liters, a quantity of water that was sufficient to sustain the garrison for a full year, even if no rain fell and no supply ship arrived, and the cisterns were guarded at all times to prevent the contamination or the sabotage that could have destroyed the castle from within, the water being tested regularly by the brother physician for signs of poison. The water system of Château Pèlerin was the invisible foundation of the fortress's endurance, a hidden network of channels and chambers that was the equal of any of the Roman aqueducts that still supplied the cities of the coast, and its design was a testament to the Templar mastery of hydraulic engineering. The role of Château Pèlerin as the primary treasury and archive of the Templar order in the East was a function that was as important as its military role, for the fortress was the vault in which the gold and the secrets of the warrior monks were stored, and its impregnable walls protected not only the lives of the garrison but the wealth and the memory of the order. The treasure and the records that were the foundation of the Templar power. The treasury of the temple, which was the financial engine of the Crusader states and which held the deposits of kings, barons, and merchants from across Europe and the Levant, was kept in the inner ward of Château Pèlerin, in a series of vaulted chambers that were carved into the bedrock and that were protected by iron doors and by the constant vigilance of the Templar guards. The treasury being the heart of the Templar banking network. The gold bezants and the silver marks that were the currency of the Crusader economy, the jewels and the precious metals that were the gifts of the faithful and the spoils of the Templar raids, the deeds and the charters that were the legal foundation of the order's vast estates in Europe and the East, all were stored in the treasury of Château Pèlerin. A treasure that was the envy of the kings of Europe and that was never captured by the enemy, despite the desperate efforts of the Mamluk sultans to seize it. The archive of the order, which contained the records of the Templar preceptories, the correspondence of the Grand Masters with the kings and the popes of Christendom, the financial ledgers that documented every transaction of the banking network, and the secret documents that were the institutional memory of the temple, was also kept at Château Pèlerin, in a chamber that was adjacent to the treasury and that was protected by the same iron doors and the same guards, the archive being the brain of the order and the treasury being its heart, and the two together constituting the most precious possession of the temple. The financial operations of the Templar order, which had begun as a simple system of donations and bequests from the faithful and which had evolved into the most sophisticated banking network in the medieval world, were centered on the treasury of Château Pèlerin, the fortress serving as the clearinghouse for the transactions that flowed through the Templar preceptories of Europe and the East. A flow of gold and silver that was the lifeblood of the Crusader economy. The Templars had developed a system of letters of credit, a form of paper money that allowed a pilgrim or a merchant to deposit his gold at a Templar preceptory in Paris or London and to withdraw it at a Templar preceptory in Jerusalem or Acre, a system that eliminated the risk of transporting coin through the bandit-infested roads of Europe and the pirate-infested waters of the Mediterranean. And the treasury of Château Pèlerin was the node through which these transactions were processed, the gold and the silver being stored in the vaults, and the letters of credit being issued and redeemed by the Templar clerks. The Templar clerks, who were the accountants and the scribes of the order and who were drawn from the ranks of the educated clergy, maintained the ledgers that recorded every deposit and every withdrawal, the accuracy and the integrity of these records being the foundation of the Templar reputation for financial probity. A reputation that was the envy of the Italian banking houses and that was the basis of the order's immense wealth and its political influence. The financial operations of Château Pèlerin were the invisible engine of the Templar military machine, for the gold that was stored in the treasury was the fuel that paid for the weapons, the provisions, the wages of the mercenaries, and the construction of the castles that defended the Holy Land, and the fortress that protected the gold was therefore the most important strategic asset of the order. The key to its ability to wage war and to sustain the Crusader presence. The archive of the Templar order, which was stored at Château Pèlerin and which was lost when the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, was a treasure trove of historical information that is now lost to us, a loss that is one of the great tragedies of medieval scholarship and that has left a void in our understanding of the inner workings of the most powerful military order of the Middle Ages. The archive contained the records of the Templar preceptories, the charters and the deeds that documented the order's vast estates in Europe and the East, the correspondence of the Grand Masters with the kings and the popes of Christendom, the financial ledgers that recorded the transactions of the banking network, and the secret documents that recorded the rituals and the traditions of the order. The esoteric knowledge that was the preserve of the initiated brothers and that was never committed to writing except in the most secure of circumstances. The archive was the institutional memory of the temple, the repository of the accumulated wisdom of the generations of brothers who had served the order since its foundation in 1120, and its loss is a wound that can never be healed, for the secrets that were contained in those documents can never be recovered, the flames that consumed the parchment having destroyed the only record of the Templar inner life. The archive of Château Pèlerin was destroyed when the fortress was evacuated in 1291, the brothers burning the documents that could not be carried away and taking the most precious records with them to Cyprus, and the destruction of the archive was the destruction of the Templar memory, a self-inflicted amputation that was the price of denying the secrets to the enemy. A sacrifice that was made with a heavy heart, but with the knowledge that the secrets of the temple must never fall into the hands of the infidel. The chapel of Château Pèlerin was the spiritual heart of the treasury and the archive, for the Templars believed that the gold and the records that were stored in the fortress were under the protection of God, and the chapel was the place where the brothers prayed for the safety of the treasure and for the wisdom to use it for the defense of the Holy Land. The prayers rising into the vaulted ceiling and drifting out across the fortress like a protective shield. The chapel, which was located in the middle ward near the treasury, was a vaulted hall of stone, its ceiling supported by columns with carved capitals that depicted the scenes of the Templar saints. George the warrior plunging his lance into the dragon, Michael the archangel casting down the rebel angels, and the martyrs of the order whose names were recited in the daily prayers. The frescoes on the walls glowing with the golden light of the Byzantine tradition. The altar, which was carved from a single block of white limestone that had been quarried in the hills of Judea, was the place where the chaplain brother performed the miracle of the Mass each morning, transforming the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ, and it was said to contain a relic of the true cross, a fragment of the wood on which Christ had died. That had been given to the order by a pious donor whose name was inscribed on the plaque that was set into the chapel wall. The brothers gathered in the chapel 8 times a day for the canonical hours, their voices rising in the Gregorian chant that was the audible signature of the Templar presence, and they confessed their sins to the chaplain brother before every battle, receiving the absolution that would send them into the fight with a clean soul and the assurance of salvation if they fell. The chapel of Château Pèlerin was a sacred space that was the soul of the fortress, and its presence was a constant reminder to the garrison that their mission was not merely military but spiritual, that the gold and the records that they guarded were the instruments of the divine will, and that the ultimate treasure was the salvation of their souls. The guards who protected the treasury and the archive were the elite of the garrison, knights and sergeants who had been selected for their loyalty and their courage and who were sworn to defend the treasure with their lives, a duty that was considered to be the highest honor that a Templar could receive, a sacred trust that was not given lightly. The guards were posted at the entrance to the treasury at all times, their swords drawn and their crossbows loaded, and they were relieved every 4 hours to ensure that their vigilance never faltered, the changing of the guard being a ceremony that was conducted with the solemnity of a religious rite, the outgoing guards saluting the incoming guards with a gesture of respect and a murmured prayer. The treasury itself was protected by a series of iron doors, each door secured by a lock that required a different key, and the keys were distributed among the commander, the draper, and the treasurer, so that no single individual could access the treasure alone, a system of checks and balances that was designed to prevent the theft or the corruption that could have crippled the order's financial operations. A system that was the product of the Templar understanding of the frailties of human nature. The guards who protected the treasury of Château Pèlerin were the custodians of the wealth that sustained the Crusader states, and their vigilance was the final line of defense for the gold and the secrets that were stored within the fortress, a defense that was never breached throughout the entire history of the castle. The strategic importance of the treasury and the archive at Château Pèlerin was a factor that the Mamluk sultans understood, for the capture of the fortress would have been a blow to the Templar order that would have been as devastating as the loss of a great battle, a blow that would have crippled the order's financial capability, and that would have exposed the secrets of the fraternity to the enemy. The gold being used to fund the Mamluk war machine and the records being used to unravel the Templar network. Baibars, who had made the destruction of the Templar castles the central project of his reign and who was a master of the art of strategic warfare, was aware of the treasure that was stored at Château Pèlerin, and the capture of that treasure was one of the objectives of his campaign against the coastal fortresses, a prize that would have made him the master of the Crusader economy. But the walls of Château Pèlerin, protected by the sea and by the massive cyclopean stones that were the signature of the fortress, were beyond the power of his siege engines to breach, and the harbor, which was the lifeline of the garrison, was protected by the Templar fleet, a fleet that the Mamluks could not challenge and that ensured that the fortress would never run out of supplies. The Sultan was forced to bypass Château Pèlerin, to leave the fortress unmolested on its promontory while he turned his attention to the weaker coastal cities, and the treasury and the archive remained in Templar hands until the final evacuation of the Holy Land, a fact that was a source of pride to the surviving brothers and a source of frustration to the Mamluk chroniclers who recorded the Sultan's campaigns. The final fate of the Templar treasury and archive at Château Pèlerin is a matter of historical speculation, for the records that would have documented the evacuation of the fortress were destroyed along with the rest of the Templar archives, and the surviving accounts, such as the Chronicle of the Templar of Tyre, are fragmentary and leave many questions unanswered. Questions that the archaeologists and the historians continue to debate. The chronicler Templar of Tyre, who was present at the evacuation of the Holy Land in 1291 and who is the most reliable source for the events of that year, records that the garrison of Château Pèlerin, having received the orders from the Grand Master to abandon the fortress, loaded the most precious items of the treasury and the archive onto the Templar ships. The gold and the jewels and the most important documents being carried to the waiting galleys by the brothers who had guarded them for so many years, their faces illuminated by the flames of the burning buildings. The remaining records, the documents that were too bulky or too numerous to transport, were burned in the courtyard of the castle, the flames consuming the parchment, and the ink and sending the smoke of the Templar memory into the sky. A sacrifice that was made to deny the secrets to the enemy. And the ships then sailed for Cyprus, where the Templar order would continue its existence for another 2 decades. The final chapter of the Templar treasury at Château Pèlerin was written not by the Mamluks but by the brothers themselves, a chapter that ended not in capture but in deliberate, defiant withdrawal, a retreat that preserved the treasure and the secrets of the order and that allowed the Templar mission to continue on the island of Cyprus, the last refuge of the warrior monks. The engineering secrets of the Cyclopean walls of Château Pèlerin have fascinated the scholars and the archaeologists who have studied the ruins of the fortress for over a century, for the size and the precision of the stone blocks that were used in the construction are unmatched in any other Crusader castle and are comparable only to the megalithic structures of the ancient world. The pyramids of Egypt and the temples of the Phoenicians. The blocks of limestone that formed the outer wall, some of them measuring nearly 5 meters in length, and weighing over 20 tons, were cut from the quarry on the promontory and were transported to the building site by a system of ramps and sleds that required the labor of hundreds of men and teams of oxen, and the logistics of the operation are a testament to the organizational genius of the Templar engineers, who had planned every detail of the process with the precision of a military campaign. The cutting of the blocks required a degree of masonry skill that was possessed only by the master masons who had been trained in the Templar workshops, men who had learned the secrets of the craft from the masters who had built the great cathedrals of Europe and who had adapted their techniques to the unique challenges of the Holy Land, the hard limestone, and the salt-laden air. And the blocks were dressed to a finish that was so smooth that the joints between them were almost invisible. A finish that was achieved by hours of patient work with hammer and chisel, the masons working in the open air under the Mediterranean sun. The walls of Château Pèlerin were the work of craftsmen who had reached the summit of their profession, and their survival after nearly 1,000 years of exposure to the salt spray and the winter storms is a testament to the quality of their construction, a quality that has never been surpassed. The transportation of the massive stone blocks from the quarry to the building site was a feat of logistics that required the construction of a special road, a road that was wide enough to accommodate the ox-drawn sleds and that was paved with stone to reduce the friction and to prevent the sleds from sinking into the sand that could have bogged down the heavy loads and brought the work to a halt. The road was graded to a gentle slope that allowed the teams of oxen to pull the loads without excessive strain, the gradient being calculated to minimize the effort required to move the immense weights, and the road was maintained by a crew of laborers who repaired the damage caused by the constant traffic, the ruts being filled with stone and the surface being kept clean of debris. The sleds themselves were massive wooden structures, their runners greased with animal fat to reduce the friction, and the stones were secured to the sleds with ropes that were anchored to iron rings that were set into the blocks, the rings being removed once the stone was in place, the holes being filled with the mortar that bonded the wall together. The teams of oxen that pulled the sleds were the largest and the strongest animals that could be obtained from the farms of the coastal plain, and they were driven by the local peasants who were employed by the order and who were paid for their labor with food and coin, the peasants being the unskilled muscle that was needed to move the immense weights, their labor being a contribution to the defense of the Holy Land. The transportation of the stones was the most labor-intensive phase of the construction, and it required a continuous effort through the summer months, when the weather was favorable and the ground was dry, the winter rains making the road impassable and bringing the work to a halt, and the Templar engineers who supervised the work were constantly seeking ways to improve the efficiency of the operation, to move the stones faster and with fewer animals. The lifting of the stones into place was accomplished by the treadwheel cranes that were erected on the rising walls, and the design of these cranes was a refinement of the machines that had been used in the construction of the great cathedrals of Europe, a refinement that increased their lifting capacity and their reliability, allowing the Templar engineers to lift the cyclopean stones that were the signature of the fortress. The treadwheel crane was a massive wooden wheel, often over 4 meters in diameter, that was mounted on a frame of timber, and that was turned by men walking inside it, their weight providing the power that was transmitted through a system of ropes and pulleys to the stone that was being lifted, the mechanical advantage of the system multiplying the force of the men's labor. The ropes were made of the finest hemp, imported from the workshops of Venice and Genoa, and they were inspected daily for signs of wear, the safety of the operation depending on the integrity of the ropes, a single broken strand being a warning that the rope must be replaced before it could fail and drop the stone to the ground, with catastrophic consequences for the men below. The pulleys and the winches were forged from the iron that was produced in the Templar workshops, the iron being of a quality that was the envy of the secular lords, and the entire lifting system was a ballet of human and mechanical power that was directed by a master rigger who used hand signals and shouted commands to coordinate the efforts of the crew, the men walking in the wheel, the men on the ropes, and the masons on the wall. The lifting of a single stone could require a team of a dozen men walking within the wheel, and the operation was a continuous cycle of lifting, setting, and returning for the next stone, a cycle that continued from dawn to dusk through the summer months. The mortar that bonded the stones of Château Pèlerin together was a secret mixture that was the product of the Templar study of the construction techniques of the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Arabs, a mixture that was designed to harden to a stone-like consistency and to resist the penetration of water and the growth of the vegetation that could crack the masonry. The mortar being a crucial component of the fortress's durability. The basic ingredients of the mortar were lime, which was produced by burning the limestone in kilns that were built on the promontory, the kilns being fed with the waste stone from the quarry and with the driftwood that was collected from the beaches, sand, which was obtained from the beaches of the coast, and which was washed to remove the salt that could have weakened the mortar, and volcanic ash, which was imported from the volcanic regions of Italy and which gave the mortar its hydraulic properties, the ability to set even underwater, a property that was essential for the construction of the fosse and the harbor works. The proportions of the ingredients were a secret that was known only to the master masons and to the Templar engineers, and the mixing of the mortar was conducted in a closed workshop that was guarded against the intrusion of the curious, the secret being a part of the intellectual property of the order, a property that was as valuable as the gold in the treasury. The mortar was applied to the joints between the stones in a thin layer, the stones being fitted so precisely that a thick layer of mortar was unnecessary, and the mortar was allowed to cure slowly, protected from the sun and the rain by the canvas covers that were draped over the walls, the curing process being essential to the strength of the bond. The mortar of Château Pèlerin has survived the salt spray and the winter storms for nearly 1,000 years, a durability that is a testament to the skill of the Templar chemists, and to the quality of the materials that they used. The talus that protected the outer wall of Château Pèlerin was a refinement of the design that the Templars had developed at Safed and at the other inland fortresses, a refinement that was dictated by the unique conditions of the coastal site and by the need to protect the wall against the erosion of the sea as well as the bombardment of the enemy. The talus being a surface that deflected both the waves and the projectiles with equal efficiency. The talus was constructed of the same cyclopean stones as the wall itself, the stones being laid at an angle of 60 degrees and being dressed to a smooth, glassy finish that was the result of hours of patient work with hammer and chisel, the finish being so smooth that a trebuchet stone would skid upward along the slope and tumble harmlessly into the fosse, its energy dissipated. The talus extended outward from the base of the wall by a distance of over 10 meters, its base being anchored into the bedrock of the promontory, and the slope was a continuous, unbroken surface that presented no purchase to the grappling hooks of the scaling ladders, the ladders sliding down the smooth stone and the attackers falling to their deaths on the rocks below. The talus served multiple functions in the defense of the castle. It deflected the stones of the trebuchets, it made the scaling ladder useless, it prevented the approach of the sappers, and it protected the base of the wall from the erosion of the sea, the waves crashing against the smooth slope and being diverted away from the masonry, their energy spent in a spray of foam. The talus of Château Pèlerin was the ultimate expression of the Templar philosophy of defense, a philosophy that sought to use the geometry of the wall to defeat the enemy rather than relying on the passive resistance of the stone, and its design was a triumph of military engineering that was never surpassed in the Crusader period. The round towers that punctuated the outer wall of Château Pèlerin were designed to provide enfilading fire along the entire length of the curtain, their curved surfaces eliminating the blind spots that were the vulnerability of the square towers of the European castles, and their arrow loops were positioned at multiple levels to create a three-dimensional field of fire that no attacker could escape. The crossbow bolts striking the attackers from above, from the sides, and from every angle. The towers were constructed of the same cyclopean stones as the wall, their walls being of the same immense thickness, and they were equipped with their own wells and their own stores of provisions, so that they could continue the fight even if the outer wall was breached, the towers becoming independent strongpoints that the attacker would have to reduce one by one, each tower a fortress within the fortress. The roofs of the towers were flat, designed to accommodate the treadwheel cranes that were used during the construction and the heavy weapons that were mounted on the fighting platform, the trebuchets, and the ballistae that were the artillery of the Templar garrison, the engines that could hurl stones back at the enemy and that could destroy the siege towers and the battering rams before they could reach the walls. The towers were connected to the inner ward by a series of underground passages, the passages allowing the garrison to move between the towers without exposing themselves to the fire of the enemy, and the passages were protected by their own portcullises and murder holes, so that an attacker who gained access to a passage would find himself in yet another trap, a dark, narrow space where the defenders could slaughter him without mercy. The towers of Château Pèlerin were fortresses within the fortress, and their design was a key factor in the castle's legendary invincibility, the towers providing the enfilading fire that made the approaches a killing ground. The harbor chain of Château Pèlerin, the massive iron barrier that protected the entrance to the harbor and that was the ultimate guarantee of the castle's supply line, was a marvel of medieval metallurgy, a chain that was forged in the Templar workshops, and that was the largest and the strongest of its kind in the world, a chain that was the lock on the door of the fortress. The chain was composed of links that were forged from the finest iron, each link weighing over 50 kilograms and being connected to the next by a massive iron pin that was secured with a cotter, the entire chain being over 100 meters in length and weighing many tons, its strength being such that no ship could break it, the chain being an impassable barrier to the enemy galleys. The chain was suspended between two towers that flanked the harbor entrance, and it was raised and lowered by a system of winches that were located within the keep, the winches being operated by teams of sergeants who could raise the chain in a matter of minutes to admit a friendly ship or to bar an enemy galley, the chain rising from the water with a groaning of the iron links and a splash of the sea. The chain was a psychological weapon as well as a physical barrier, for the sight of the massive iron links rising from the water was a declaration that the harbor was closed, a declaration that the Mamluks could not challenge, and the Templar ships that lay at anchor within the harbor were safe from any assault from the sea, the chain being the ultimate guarantee of the fortress's invincibility. The harbor chain of Château Pèlerin was never broken, and its existence was the reason that the castle could never be starved into surrender, the supply ships entering and leaving the harbor at the will of the commander, the chain being lowered to admit the friendly vessels and raised to bar the enemy, a cycle that continued through the long years of the Mamluk siege. The double walls of Château Pèlerin were the feature that most impressed the chroniclers who visited the fortress and that most frustrated the Muslim commanders who attempted to take it, for the double walls created a defense in depth that was unmatched in any other Crusader castle and that transformed any breach into a trap from which there was no escape, a trap that had been designed with the cold, calculating precision that was the hallmark of the Templar engineers. The outer wall, which was the first line of defense, and which faced the landward side of the promontory, was separated from the inner wall by a distance of some 50 meters, a space that was a carefully designed killing ground, a flat, open area that was completely exposed to the fire of the crossbowmen on the inner wall and the enfilading fire of the towers that flanked the space. The inner wall, which was higher and thicker than the outer wall, was the final barrier before the inner ward, and its battlements rose above the level of the outer wall so that the defenders on the inner wall could fire over the heads of the defenders on the outer wall, their crossbows commanding the entire outer ward and the approaches beyond. The double walls were connected by a series of postern gates and underground passages, the passages allowing the garrison to move between the walls without exposing themselves to the fire of the enemy, and the passages were protected by their own portcullises and murder holes, so that an attacker who entered a passage would find himself in a trap within a trap, a dark, narrow space where the defenders could slaughter him from above. The double walls of Château Pèlerin were a system of layered defense, each layer designed to delay and damage the attacker, to strip away his numbers and his momentum, and their design was the culmination of the Templar understanding of the art of the siege, a design that had been tested and refined in the fires of 100 battles. The space between the walls, the outer ward of the concentric plan, was a killing ground that was designed to be the grave of any attacker who succeeded in breaching the outer defenses, a space that was as deadly as the barbican, and that was the ultimate expression of the Templar doctrine of defense in depth. The distance between the walls was calculated to be within the effective range of the crossbows on the inner wall, so that an attacker who entered the space was immediately under fire, his every movement tracked by the crossbowmen on the higher parapet, and there was no place to hide, for the ground was leveled and cleared of any cover, the buildings that might have provided shelter being deliberately omitted from the design. The surface of the outer ward was paved with loose stones that made running difficult and that amplified the sound of the attacker's approach, the stones clattering under the feet of the advancing soldiers and alerting the garrison to their presence, the noise echoing between the walls and adding to the terror of the assault. The towers that flanked the outer ward provided enfilading fire along the entire length of the space, the crossbow bolts sweeping the killing ground from both flanks, striking the attackers in the sides where their shields offered no protection, the bolts piercing the chain mail and the leather and the flesh with a sound that was the constant accompaniment of the assault. The attacker who broke into the space between the walls found himself in a shooting gallery, a space where every step forward was a step closer to death, and the only way out was to assault the inner gate, which was itself a fortress within a fortress, protected by its own barbican, its own portcullises, and its own garrison, or to retreat through the breach by which he had entered. A retreat that was often blocked by the press of his own advancing troops, the soldiers behind pushing forward, while those in front tried to flee. The space between the walls of Château Pèlerin was the ultimate trap, a space that was designed to consume the enemy's army, to turn a breach into a massacre, and no attacker who entered it ever reached the inner gate, for the crossbow bolts and the stones and the Greek fire that rained down from the walls were a storm that no flesh could withstand. The double walls of Château Pèlerin were a machine for the industrial scale slaughter of the enemy, and their design was the product of the collective intelligence of the Templar Order, a design that was the most advanced of its age, and that was never defeated in battle. The inner gate of Château Pèlerin was a masterpiece of defensive architecture, a structure that was designed to be the final barrier before the inner ward and that incorporated every innovation that the Templars had developed in the art of gate defense, an art that they had been perfecting for over a century in the crucible of the Holy Land. The inner gate was offset from the outer gate, so that an attacker who forced the outer barbican and crossed the outer ward would have to traverse the entire length of the killing ground before reaching the inner entrance, a journey of 50 meters under the continuous fire of the defenders on the inner wall and the towers, a journey that few ever completed. The inner gate was protected by a barbican of its own, a walled enclosure that projected into the outer ward and that forced the attacker to negotiate a series of turns under the fire of the flanking towers, each turn exposing a new flank to the crossbowmen on the walls above, the crossbow bolts striking the attackers in the side where their shields offered no protection, the bolts finding the gaps in the armor, and the joints in the mail. The passage through the inner barbican was narrow, lined with murder holes and arrow loops, and the floor of the passage was sloped downward toward the entrance, so that the boiling water, the heated sand, and the Greek fire that were poured from the murder holes would flow toward the attackers, carrying with them the bodies of the dead and creating a slippery, burning tide that made the passage a vision of hell. The inner doors were a massive structure of iron-bound oak, the timbers cut from the cedars of Lebanon and bound with iron bands that were forged in the Templar workshops, and the doors were backed by a series of bars and bolts that were operated from within the gatehouse, the bars being massive timbers that were dropped into iron brackets on either side of the door, securing the door against the assault of the battering ram. The inner gate of Château Pèlerin was never forced, for no attacker could survive the journey through the outer barbican, the killing ground, and the inner barbican to reach the doors, and the gate stood as a silent sentinel throughout the entire history of the fortress, a testament to the Templar mastery of the art of defense. The deep moat that surrounded Château Pèlerin on its landward side was a barrier that was as effective as the walls themselves, a moat that was filled with seawater and that was crossed by a single drawbridge that was protected by the outer barbican, the drawbridge being the only access point to the fortress from the mainland and being entirely under the control of the defenders. The moat was carved through the solid rock of the promontory, a labor that had taken the Crusader pilgrims months to complete, and that had cost the lives of many of the laborers, the rock being hard and unyielding and the work being conducted under the constant threat of the Muslim raiders who patrolled the coastal plain, their arrows striking down the workers who could not seek shelter. The moat was over 10 meters deep and over 20 meters wide, dimensions that made it impossible for a siege tower to be brought to the walls, for the tower would have to be built on the far side of the moat and would have to span the entire width before it could reach the battlements, a feat of engineering that was beyond the capabilities of the Muslim armies, whose siege towers were designed to roll on level ground. The moat was also impossible to mine, for any tunnel that attempted to pass beneath it would flood, the seawater pouring into the excavation and drowning the sappers in their own tunnel, and the Templars had designed the sluice gates to maintain the water level even during the dry season, the moat being a permanent barrier that was never empty, its waters a mirror that reflected the walls and the sky. The moat of Château Pèlerin was a work of human labor that had transformed the natural defenses of the promontory into an artificial island, and its presence was the reason that the fortress was never assaulted from the landward side with any prospect of success, the Mamluk commanders recognizing that the moat was an obstacle that could not be overcome by any means at their disposal. The drawbridge that spanned the moat was a feat of mechanical engineering, a bridge that could be raised or lowered in a matter of minutes and that was operated by a system of counterweights and winches that were located within the outer barbican, the mechanism being a closely guarded secret of the order and being accessible only to the engineers who were responsible for its maintenance. The drawbridge was constructed of massive timbers of Lebanese cedar, the same wood that had been used for the ships of the Phoenicians and the Temple of Solomon, bound with iron bands and covered with a layer of iron plates that protected the wood from the fire arrows of the enemy, the plates being a defense against the incendiary weapons that could have turned the bridge into a blazing torch. The bridge was wide enough to accommodate a cart or a column of soldiers marching four abreast, and in times of peace it was the artery that connected the fortress to the mainland, the caravans and the pilgrims crossing it under the watchful eyes of the guards. In times of war, the drawbridge was raised, its massive timbers swinging upward on iron hinges and coming to rest against the face of the barbican, the bridge itself becoming a shield that protected the gate from the assault of the battering ram, and the garrison could then destroy the bridge entirely, cutting the last link between the fortress and the land, a final act of defiance that would leave the castle isolated on its island, protected by the sea and the moat. The drawbridge of Château Pèlerin was the only access point to the fortress from the landward side, and it was a point that was entirely under the control of the commander, a point that could be opened or closed at his will, a point that was the gate to the impregnable sea castle. The Mamluk siege tactics that had been so effective against the inland castles, the mining and the bombardment that had reduced the walls of Safed and Caesarea and that had brought down the great fortress of Beaufort, were utterly useless against Château Pèlerin, a fact that the Mamluk commanders recognized and that they recorded in their chronicles with a mixture of frustration and admiration. The mining, which had been the most feared threat to a medieval fortress, was impossible at Château Pèlerin because the moat and the sea surrounded the castle on all sides, and any tunnel that was dug toward the walls would flood before it could reach the foundations, the seawater pouring into the excavation and drowning the sappers, their bodies being swept away by the currents. The bombardment, which had been the primary weapon of the Mamluk siege trains, was ineffective against the massive talus and the cyclopean walls of the fortress, the stones of the trebuchets skidding off the smooth surface of the talus and falling harmlessly into the moat, the impact of the stones being absorbed by the slope and the thickness of the masonry. And the trebuchets themselves were vulnerable to the counter-bombardment of the Templar engines that were mounted on the towers, the Templar artillery being directed by experienced gunners who could strike the enemy's machines with devastating accuracy. The assault, which had been the final resort of the Mamluk commanders when the walls were breached and the defenders were exhausted, was never attempted at Château Pèlerin because the walls were never breached, the cyclopean stones defying the efforts of the enemy engineers, and the garrison remained strong and well supplied behind their impregnable defenses. The Mamluk sultans, having failed to take the fortress by any of the conventional means, adopted a strategy of bypassing it, leaving the castle unmolested on its promontory while they concentrated their forces on the weaker coastal cities, and Château Pèlerin remained in Templar hands until the final evacuation of the Holy Land, a defiant outpost of Christian power that the sultans could not conquer. The psychological impact of the Mamluk failure to take Château Pèlerin was a factor that the Templars exploited to the full, for the reputation of the fortress as the impregnable sea castle grew with each passing year, and the knowledge that the Templar treasury and archive were safe within its walls was a comfort to the Franks who fought and died on the walls of the other strongholds. A comfort that sustained their morale through the darkest days of the Mamluk advance. The Muslim chroniclers, who recorded the victories and the defeats of the sultans with a meticulous attention to detail, wrote of Château Pèlerin as a fortress that was invincible, a place that was protected by the sea and by the magic of the Franks, and the legend of the impregnable sea castle became a part of the folklore of the region. A story that was told in the camps of the Mamluk soldiers and in the markets of Damascus and Cairo, a story that grew in the telling. The Templars, who understood the power of the legend and who cultivated it with a deliberate care, did nothing to dispel the stories, knowing that the fear of the fortress was a weapon that was as effective as the walls, and the garrison of Château Pèlerin watched with a quiet satisfaction as the Mamluk armies marched past the promontory on their way to the siege of Acre, knowing that their castle would never be taken, that their walls were the strongest in the Holy Land, and that their harbor was the lifeline that could never be cut. The psychological warfare that was waged from the walls of Château Pèlerin was a silent campaign that complemented the physical defenses, and it was a campaign that was entirely successful, for the fortress was never assaulted with the full force of the Mamluk army, the sultans preferring to conserve their strength for the weaker targets that could actually be taken. The harbor of Château Pèlerin was not merely a supply line. It was a fully functional naval base that served as the headquarters of the Templar fleet in the eastern Mediterranean, a fleet that was the instrument of the Order's maritime power, and that was the guarantor of the fortress's invincibility, the ships that were based at the fortress being the most advanced vessels of their kind in the Crusader East. The Templar ships, the war galleys and the supply vessels that were the backbone of the fleet, were constructed of the finest materials that could be obtained, their hulls built from the cedar of Lebanon and the oak of Europe, their sails woven from the hemp of the Italian workshops, and their ropes and rigging made from the same materials that were used in the treadwheel cranes. The entire vessel being a product of the Templar commitment to quality in every aspect of their operations. The war galleys, which were the fighting ships of the fleet, were equipped with the rams that could pierce the hull of an enemy vessel below the waterline, sending the ship to the bottom with all hands, and with the Greek fire projectors that could launch pots of liquid flame onto the decks of the enemy, the flame clinging to the wood and the flesh and being impossible to extinguish. The projectors being operated by the brother sailors who had been trained in their use. The supply vessels, which were the cargo ships of the fleet, were the workhorses of the Templar maritime operation, their holds filled with the grain, the wine, the weapons, and the gold that sustained the garrisons of the coastal fortresses, and they plied the waters between Cyprus, Italy, and the Holy Land in a continuous shuttle that was the lifeline of the Crusader states. The ships sailing in convoys that were protected by the war galleys. The shipyards of Château Pèlerin, which were located on the quays of the harbor and which were a part of the industrial infrastructure of the fortress, were capable of building and repairing the Templar vessels, the shipwrights who worked there being the lay brothers of the order who had been trained in the art of shipbuilding in the workshops of Venice and Genoa and who had brought their skills to the Holy Land. The shipyards were equipped with the saws, the hammers, the drills, the planes, and the chisels that were needed for the construction of the wooden hulls, and the timber that was used in the work was imported from the forests of Lebanon and Anatolia, the cedar and the pine and the oak that were the traditional materials of the Mediterranean shipwright. The timber being stored in the warehouses on the quays to season and to dry before it was used. The ironwork that was needed for the ships, the nails that held the planks together, the chains that anchored the vessels, the anchors themselves, and the rams that were the weapons of the war galleys, was forged in the Templar workshops, the brother smiths working at their forges to produce the metal components that were the skeleton of the vessels, their hammers ringing across the harbor from dawn to dusk. The quality of the Templar ironwork was renowned throughout the Crusader states, for the brother smiths had access to the finest ore and to the secrets of the forging process that were the intellectual property of the order, and the ships that were built at Château Pèlerin were the strongest and the most durable in the eastern Mediterranean. The shipyards of Château Pèlerin were a factory of maritime power, a place where the ships that sustained the Crusader presence in the Holy Land were built and maintained, and their output was essential to the survival of the kingdom, for without the Templar fleet, the coastal cities would have been starved into surrender long before the Mamluk armies breached their walls. The brother sailors who manned the Templar fleet were a distinct branch of the order, a community of mariners who had taken the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as the knights and the sergeants, and who lived according to a modified rule that was adapted to the conditions of the sea, a rule that governed their conduct on the ships as strictly as the rule of the land governed the conduct of the garrison. The brother sailors were recruited from the maritime communities of Europe, from the ports of Italy, France, and Spain, and they brought with them the skills and the knowledge that were the inheritance of the Mediterranean seafaring tradition, a tradition that extended back to the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and that was the foundation of the European naval power. The daily life of the brother sailors was governed by the same cycle of prayer and discipline that regulated the life of the land-based brothers, the canonical hours being observed on the decks of the ships, the brothers gathering to chant the psalms with the sea as their cathedral and the sky as their vault, and the rule being enforced by the commanders of the vessels, who were responsible for the conduct and the safety of their crews. The brother sailors were the guardians of the Templar supply lines, the men who sailed the ships that carried the grain and the weapons to the beleaguered garrisons of the Holy Land, and their courage and their skill were as essential to the defense of the Crusader states as the courage and the skill of the knights who fought on the walls, for without the supplies that they delivered, the garrisons would have perished. The harbor of Château Pèlerin was their home, the place where they returned after each voyage to rest and to repair their ships, and the fortress was a sanctuary for them as much as it was for the land-based garrison, a place of safety in a world that was consumed by war. The navigation of the Templar ships along the coast of the Holy Land was a complex art that required a detailed knowledge of the winds, the currents, the tides, and the hazards of the coastal waters, a knowledge that was possessed by the brother sailors and that was passed down from generation to generation in the oral tradition of the order, for the Templars, like the other seafaring peoples of the Mediterranean, relied on the accumulated experience of their elders rather than on written manuals. The coast of Palestine, with its rocky promontories, its shifting sandbars, and its sudden storms that could arise without warning, was a dangerous place for a ship, and the brother sailors learned to read the signs of the sea, the color of the water that indicated the depth, the shape of the waves that indicated the presence of a reef, the behavior of the birds that indicated the proximity of land, and the direction of the wind that indicated the coming weather. The ships sailed by day, navigating by the landmarks of the coast, the mountain of Carmel with its monastery, the promontory of Atlit with its fortress, the towers of Caesarea and Arsuf, and the walls of Acre, and by night they anchored in the sheltered bays or continued their voyage under the guidance of the stars, the brother sailors being skilled in the use of the astrolabe and the compass, instruments that had been introduced to the Mediterranean by the Arabs and that the Templars had adopted. The navigation of the Templar fleet was a triumph of empirical knowledge, a knowledge that was stored in the minds of the sailors and that was passed from master to apprentice through years of training, and its loss is one of the many tragedies of the suppression of the order, for the secrets of the Templar navigation died with the brother sailors who possessed them, the last of the mariners going to their graves with the knowledge of the sea. The naval power of the Templar order, which was centered on the harbor of Château Pèlerin, and which was the most powerful naval force in the eastern Mediterranean, was a factor that the Mamluk sultans could not match, for the Mamluks were a land-based power whose military tradition was rooted in the cavalry and the archery of the steppes, and they had no fleet that could challenge the Templar ships in the open sea. The Mamluk sultans, recognizing the importance of the sea, attempted to build a navy, requisitioning the ships of the Egyptian and Syrian ports and hiring the sailors of the Mediterranean, but their efforts were never sufficient to match the Templar fleet, which was a professional force that had been honed by decades of experience, and that was supported by the industrial infrastructure of the Château Pèlerin shipyards. The daily life of the garrison of Château Pèlerin was a rhythm of prayer, work, and vigilance that was timed to the canonical hours of the monastic day and to the tides that governed the access to the harbor, a rhythm that was as unchanging as the rise and the set of the sun, and that was the foundation of the Templar discipline, the discipline that had made the order the most formidable fighting force of the medieval world. The brothers rose at midnight for the office of matins, the most demanding of the monastic hours, and they gathered in the chapel, their white mantles visible in the candlelight, their voices rising in the Gregorian chant that had been sung by the monks of the desert and the cathedrals of Europe, the chant echoing through the vaulted space and drifting out across the harbor to the ships that lay at anchor. The sailors on the ships crossing themselves and murmuring a prayer of their own. The chapel was the heart of the fortress, a sacred space that was the equal of any cathedral in the beauty of its architecture and the richness of its decoration, and the brothers who gathered there each night were the custodians of a spiritual tradition that was as old as the church itself, a tradition that connected them to the apostles and the martyrs who had gone before. The office of matins was followed by a period of rest, and then by the office of lauds at dawn, the brothers giving thanks for the return of the light that revealed the enemy's positions on the mainland and the state of the sea that would determine the day's operations, the morning watch being the time when the sentries were changed and the patrols were dispatched to sweep the coastal plain and the waters of the harbor. The morning meal, which was taken in the great hall after the celebration of Mass, was a simple affair of bread, cheese, and watered wine, consumed in silence while a lector read from the scriptures or the rule, the reading being the only sound in the hall besides the clinking of the cups and the knives. The silence being a discipline that was intended to focus the minds of the brothers on the spiritual nourishment that accompanied the physical. The great hall of Château Pèlerin was a magnificent chamber, its vaulted ceiling supported by columns of the local limestone, the capitals carved with the scenes of the Templar saints, and the walls hung with the banners of the order, and the trophies of the sea battles that the Templar fleet had won, the captured standards of the Muslim emirs and the flags of the enemy's ships that had been sunk. The commander's table, which was set on a raised dais at the end of the hall, was the place where the orders were given and the reports were received, and the discipline that was maintained in the hall was the same as the discipline that was maintained on the walls, a silence that was broken only by the voice of the lector and the commands of the officers, the entire garrison being a community of silence and of purpose. The morning meal was the only time of the day when the entire garrison was gathered in one place, and it was a time when the commander could observe the state of his men, to see the weariness in their eyes and the strength in their bearing, and to assess their readiness for the duties that awaited them, the duties that were the daily defense of the fortress. The duties of the day were assigned by the commander and his officers, the knights and the sergeants taking their turns on the walls, in the towers, and on the patrols that swept the coastal plain and the waters of the harbor, the watch being a continuous cycle that was never broken, for the safety of the fortress depended on the vigilance of the garrison. The walls of Château Pèlerin were manned at all times, the crossbowmen standing at their posts behind the arrow loops, their weapons loaded and their eyes scanning the approaches, and the towers were occupied by the garrisons that were responsible for the enfilading fire along the curtain, the crossbow bolts sweeping the killing ground between the walls and the approaches from the sea. The patrols that were dispatched from the castle each morning rode the circuit of the coastal plain, the Turcopole light cavalry and the Templar sergeants observing the movements of the enemy and reporting any sign of a build-up of forces that might signal an impending assault, their reports being the raw material of the commander's strategic decisions, the intelligence that allowed him to prepare the fortress for the siege that might come. The harbor was guarded by a detachment of brother sailors who were responsible for the operation of the chain and the inspection of the incoming vessels, the chain being raised and lowered as the supply ships arrived and departed, and the warehouses that lined the quays were the scene of the continuous labor of the unloading and the storage of the cargoes, the grain and the wine and the weapons that sustained the garrison. The day was a cycle of duty that ended with the office of vespers and the evening meal, and the brothers retired to their barracks with the knowledge that the walls were guarded and the sea was watched, the darkness being the time of prayer and of rest before the cycle began again at midnight. The training of the garrison was a continuous process that was conducted in the outer ward, where the knights practiced their swordplay and their horsemanship under the direction of the marshal, and the crossbowmen fired at the targets that were set at the known distances along the approach road, their bolts striking the targets with the precision that was the product of constant practice. The training being designed to maintain the physical readiness of the brothers and to sharpen the skills that would be needed in the event of an assault. The knights, who were the heavy cavalry that was the striking arm of the garrison, practiced the maneuvers that were needed for the charge, the wedge formation that was the Templar battle tactic, and they exercised their horses in the outer ward to keep the animals fit and responsive to their commands, the horses being the partners of the knights in the dance of war. The crossbowmen, who were the primary defensive force of the castle, practiced the volley fire that was needed to break the momentum of an assault, their bolts striking the targets in a continuous rain of steel, and they learned to aim for the gaps in the armor, the visor slits and the armpits and the groin, where a bolt could kill with a single shot, the crossbow being a weapon of precision and of power. The training of the garrison was the foundation of its military effectiveness, and the brothers who trained in the outer ward were the living weapons of the fortress, their skills being the complement of the walls that protected them, and their discipline being the product of the rule that governed their lives. The medical care of the garrison was provided by the brother physicians who were stationed in the hospital of Château Pèlerin, a facility that was equipped with the beds, the medicines, and the surgical instruments that were the standard of the Templar medical service, a standard that was among the highest in the medieval world and that reflected the order's commitment to the corporal works of mercy. The hospital was located in the inner ward, near the chapel, so that the sick and the wounded could hear the prayers of the brothers as they lay in their beds, the sound of the chant being a comfort to the suffering and a reminder of the presence of God in the midst of their pain. The brother physicians, who had studied the medical texts of the Arabs and the Greeks and who were skilled in the treatment of the wounds and the diseases that afflicted the garrison, were capable of performing the surgeries that were needed to remove an arrowhead or to set a broken bone, and their knowledge of the antiseptic properties of honey and wine was a secret that saved countless lives. The wounds being cleaned with the wine and dressed with the honey, the infections that were the greatest killer of the wounded being kept at bay by the skill of the physicians. The hospital also served the local Christian population, who were permitted to bring their sick to the castle for treatment, a service that bound the local communities to the order and that provided the Templars with a source of intelligence about the conditions in the surrounding countryside, the grateful villagers sharing the news of the Muslim troop movements that they had observed. The medical care that was available at Château Pèlerin was a reflection of the Templar commitment to the care of the body and the soul, and it was a source of comfort to the garrison, who knew that they would be cared for if they were wounded in the defense of the fortress, a knowledge that sustained their morale through the long years of the siege. The spiritual life of the garrison was centered on the chapel, the sacred space that was the soul of the fortress, and the brothers who gathered there each day were sustained by the faith that was the foundation of their vocation, the faith that gave meaning to their sacrifices and that transformed the defense of the castle into an act of worship. The chaplain brothers who served in the chapel were the spiritual fathers of the garrison, the men who heard the confessions and who administered the sacraments, and their presence was a constant reminder that the defense of the Holy Land was not merely a military mission but a spiritual calling, a calling that required the purification of the soul as well as the strength of the arm. The brothers confessed their sins before each battle, receiving the absolution that would send them into the fight with a clean soul and the assurance of salvation if they fell, and the Eucharist that they received at the daily Mass was the food of their spiritual life, the body and blood of Christ that united them with the divine and with each other in a communion that transcended the bonds of blood. The chapel of Château Pèlerin, with its relic of the true cross and its frescoes of the Templar saints, was a piece of the heavenly Jerusalem transplanted to the coast of the Holy Land, and the prayers that were offered within its walls were the invisible shield that protected the fortress as surely as the walls of stone, a shield that was woven from the faith and the devotion of the warrior monks. The morale of the garrison was sustained by the knowledge that their fortress was invincible, that the walls that they guarded had never been breached, and that the sea that surrounded them could never be controlled by the enemy. And this knowledge was a source of pride and of confidence that was reflected in the bearing of the brothers, the way they walked and the way they spoke. A quiet assurance that was the product of the Templar discipline and the Templar faith. The garrison of Château Pèlerin, isolated on their promontory with the sea on one side and the Mamluk army on the other, were a community that was bound together by the shared experience of the siege and by the shared commitment to the defense of the order's most precious possession, the treasury, and the archive that were stored within the walls, the gold and the records that were the lifeblood of the temple. The brothers knew that the treasure that they guarded was essential to the survival of the Templar mission, and they were determined to protect it at any cost, a determination that was reinforced by the daily prayers and by the example of the commander, who shared their hardships and who led from the front, his white mantle stained with the salt of the sea and the dust of the walls. The morale of the garrison was the secret weapon of Château Pèlerin, a weapon that the Mamluk besiegers could not match, and it was the reason that the fortress held out until the very end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, the brothers refusing to surrender even when the kingdom crumbled around them, their faith and their discipline being the unbreakable core of the impregnable sea fortress. The Mamluk Sultan Baibars, who had conquered the inland castles of the Templars and who had made the destruction of the Crusader fortresses the central project of his reign, never succeeded in taking Château Pèlerin, and the fortress remained in Templar hands throughout his reign and the reigns of his successors. A defiant outpost of Christian power on the coast of the Holy Land that the sultans were forced to bypass rather than to conquer, a fact that was a source of immense pride to the garrison and of immense frustration to the Mamluk chroniclers. Baibars, who was a master of the art of siege warfare and who had reduced the walls of Safed, Caesarea, and Arsuf with his trebuchets and his sappers, recognized that Château Pèlerin was a different kind of fortress, a fortress that was protected by the sea and by the massive cyclopean walls that were the signature of the Templar coastal citadels, and he made the strategic decision to leave the fortress unmolested, to concentrate his forces on the weaker coastal cities that could be taken, without the expenditure of the time and the lives that a siege of Château Pèlerin would require. The Mamluk army marched past the promontory on its way to the sieges of Acre and Tripoli, the soldiers gazing at the walls of the sea fortress with a mixture of awe and frustration, knowing that the castle was impregnable and that the Templar ships that sailed from its harbor were the lifeline of the Crusader resistance, and the Sultan's chroniclers recorded the bypassing of the fortress as a strategic necessity. A recognition that the walls of Château Pèlerin were beyond the power of any army to breach. The bypassing of Château Pèlerin was a tactical admission of the fortress's invincibility, an admission that was celebrated by the garrison and that was remembered by the Templar chroniclers as a victory without a battle, a triumph of engineering and of strategic sighting. The role of Château Pèlerin as a refuge for the Templar order during the crises of the final decades of the Crusader presence was a function that was as important as its role as a treasury and a naval base, for the fortress was the place to which the Grand Masters retreated when the cities of the coast were under threat, and its walls provided a sanctuary that could never be breached. A safe haven in a world that was collapsing under the Mamluk onslaught. The Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, who was the last Grand Master to rule from the Holy Land and who died defending Acre in 1291, spent much of his tenure at Château Pèlerin, directing the defense of the Crusader states from the safety of the sea fortress, his orders being carried by the Templar ships to the garrisons of the coastal cities. And his presence in the castle was a symbol of the order's resilience in the face of the Mamluk advance. The fortress also served as a refuge for the civilian population of the coastal plain, the Christian villagers who fled before the Mamluk raiders and who sought shelter within the walls of the castle, their families and their livestock being accommodated in the outer ward, the garrison providing for their needs from the stores of the magazines and the cisterns, and the presence of the civilians being a reminder to the brothers of the people whose lives depended on the strength of the walls. Château Pèlerin was a city of refuge, a place of safety in a land that was being consumed by the war, and its walls protected not only the Templar brothers but the faithful who had placed their trust in the order, the widows and the orphans and the elderly who had no other hope of survival, and the garrison's defense of the fortress was a defense of the innocent as well as of the treasure. The intelligence operations that were conducted from Château Pèlerin were a critical component of the Templar defense of the Holy Land, for the fortress was the eyes and the ears of the order on the coast, and the information that was gathered by the Templar scouts and the local informants was the basis of the strategic decisions that were made by the Grand Master in Acre. The intelligence being the foundation of the Templar strategy. The Turco-Pole cavalry, who were based at Château Pèlerin and who were the primary instrument of the intelligence gathering, rode the circuit of the coastal plain on a daily basis, their patrols observing the movements of the Mamluk army and reporting any sign of a buildup of forces that might signal an impending assault on one of the coastal cities. Their reports being transmitted to Acre by the signal fires and the mounted couriers that were the communication system of the Templar network. The Templar ships that were based at the fortress also served as intelligence gatherers, their captains observing the movements of the Muslim fleets and the preparations that were being made in the ports of Egypt and Syria, the ships sailing close to the enemy coast under the cover of darkness to observe the buildup of the invasion forces. Their reports being a valuable supplement to the information that was gathered by the land-based patrols. The intelligence that was gathered at Château Pèlerin allowed the Grand Master to anticipate the enemy's moves and to allocate the Templar forces to the points of greatest danger, and it was a factor in the prolonged survival of the Crusader states in the face of the overwhelming Mamluk superiority, the intelligence network being the invisible weapon that multiplied the effectiveness of the Templar arms. The diplomatic role of Château Pèlerin, as the seat of the Templar Grand Master during his visits to the fortress, was a function that reflected the political importance of the order in the affairs of the Crusader states, for the Grand Master was one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. And the fortress that served as his residence was the site of the negotiations and the councils that shaped the destiny of the Holy Land. The Great Hall of Château Pèlerin, with its vaulted ceiling and its massive fireplace, was the setting for the meetings between the Grand Master and the ambassadors of the European kings, the barons of the Crusader states, and the envoys of the Muslim emirs, the negotiations being conducted in the French that was the common language of the Frankish aristocracy, with the Arabic translators standing at the elbow of the Grand Master. The fortress also served as the site of the Templar councils, the meetings of the Grand Master and the senior officers of the order, at which the strategy of the Templar defense was determined and the resources of the order were allocated, the councils being the governing body of the temple in the east, and the decisions that were made within the walls of Château Pèlerin affecting the lives of thousands. The diplomatic role of Château Pèlerin was a reflection of the order's status as a sovereign power, a state within the state, and the fortress was the physical manifestation of that power, a place that was the equal of any royal palace in the dignity and the authority of its occupant, the Grand Master being the head of the most powerful military order of the medieval world. The relationship between the Templar garrison of Château Pèlerin and the local population of the coastal plain was a symbiotic bond that was essential to the functioning of the fortress, for the fortress depended on the local Christians for the food, the labor, and the intelligence that were the necessities of its existence. And the local Christians depended on the fortress for the protection that was the guarantee of their survival in a land that was consumed by war. The villages of the coastal plain, the communities of Syrian Christians and Maronites that had lived in the region for centuries and that had been under Muslim rule before the coming of the Crusaders, were the primary source of the fresh produce that supplemented the garrison's diet, the vegetables and the fruit and the olive oil that were the products of the local agriculture. The villagers bringing their goods to the gates of the castle and exchanging them for the silver bezants that were the currency of the Crusader economy. The Templars protected these villages from the raids of the Bedouin and the Muslim emirs with a vigilance that was motivated by self-interest as well as by charity, for the loss of the villages would have meant the loss of the supplies that were essential to the fortress, and the garrison's patrols were a constant presence on the roads and the fields of the coastal plain. The villagers, in return, provided the fortress with the laborers who repaired the walls and the roads, and they provided the recruits for the Turco-Pole cavalry, the local light horsemen who were the eyes and ears of the garrison, their knowledge of the terrain and their fluency in Arabic making them invaluable as scouts and as spies, the villagers being the ears of the fortress in the enemy's territory. The symbiosis between the fortress and the villages was a model of the kind of relationship that the Crusader states needed to survive, a relationship that was based on mutual interest and that provided the depth of defense that the walls alone could not supply. And its success was a testament to the political as well as the military skills of the Templar commanders, who understood that the defense of the Holy Land required the support of the people who lived there. The cultural life of the garrison of Château Pèlerin, though limited by the strict rule of the order and by the constant demands of the military duty, was enriched by the presence of the brothers who had come from every corner of Europe and who brought with them the languages, the traditions, and the skills of their homelands. The fortress being a microcosm of the multicultural society of the Crusader states, and a place where the cultures of the West and the East mingled. The knights who served in the garrison were drawn from the noble families of France, England, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula, and their conversation, when the rule permitted it, and when the silence was lifted for the brief periods of recreation, was a mixture of the tongues of Europe, the French that was the common language of the order and the Latin that was the language of the Church, interspersed with the Arabic that many of the brothers had learned during their service in the East End. That was essential for the interrogation of prisoners and the negotiation with the local headmen. The sergeants and the lay brothers, who were the non-noble members of the order and who were drawn from a similar range of regions, brought with them the craft traditions of their homelands, the skills of the smith, the mason, the carpenter, and the shipwright that were essential to the functioning of the fortress. And the workshops of Château Pèlerin were a place where the techniques of Europe and the techniques of the East were combined. The Templar innovations being the product of this cultural fusion. The cultural diversity of the garrison was a strength, for it meant that the order could draw on a wide range of talents and experiences, and the brothers who served at Château Pèlerin were a community that was united not by the accident of a common origin but by the shared commitment to the Templar ideal. An ideal that transcended the boundaries of nation and language and that bound the brothers together in a fellowship that was stronger than the ties of blood. The end of the Templar presence at Château Pèlerin in 1291 was not a defeat, but a deliberate withdrawal, a decision that was made by the Grand Master after the fall of Acre and that was executed with the same efficiency and the same defiance that had characterized the entire history of the fortress, the withdrawal being a final act of Templar honor in a land that was being lost to the enemy. The garrison, having received the orders to evacuate, loaded the treasure, the archive, and the most precious of the chapel's relics onto the Templar ships, the gold and the records and the holy objects that were the lifeblood of the order being carried to the waiting galleys by the brothers who had guarded them for so many years, their faces illuminated by the flames of the burning buildings that they had set alight with their own hands. The interior of the castle was then destroyed, the great hall and the barracks and the storerooms being consumed by the fire, to deny the use of the fortress to the Mamluks, and the garrison marched proudly to the ships, their busant flying and their weapons still in their hands, refusing to surrender even as the flames consumed the buildings behind them, the smoke rising into the sky as a final testament to the Templar defiance. The ships sailed for Cyprus, and the fortress of Château Pèlerin, the impregnable sea castle that had defied the Mamluk Empire for over 7 decades, was left empty, a ruin of smoke and stone on the edge of the sea, a monument to the Templar spirit and to the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, a presence that had lasted for nearly 2 centuries and that had been defended by the walls that the Templars had raised. The archaeological remains of Château Pèlerin, which are still visible on the coast south of Haifa, are the most complete and the most evocative ruins of any Templar fortress, a place where the visitor can still walk the walls that were built by the Crusader pilgrims and can gaze out over the sea that was the lifeline of the garrison. The sea that still crashes against the promontory with the same rhythm that it did in the days of the Templar occupation. The site, which is now a national park under the protection of the Israeli authorities and which is a place of pilgrimage for the students of medieval military architecture, has been the subject of archaeological investigation for over a century, the excavations revealing the details of the Templar construction and the successive occupations of the promontory by the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Crusaders, and the Muslims, each layer of occupation adding a new chapter to the story of the site. The massive cyclopean walls of the outer enceinte are still standing, their stones weathered by the salt spray of the Mediterranean and by the winter storms that batter the coast, but still fitted with the precision that amazed the medieval chroniclers, the joints between the blocks being as fine as they were on the day that they were laid, a testament to the skill of the Templar masons. The talus that protected the base of the walls is still visible, its surface smoothed by the centuries of wind and wave but still defying the efforts of the climbers who attempt to scale it, the slope being as effective a defense today as it was when the Muslim armies attempted to storm the fortress. And the fosse that cut off the promontory from the mainland is now silted with the sand of the centuries. But its outline can still be traced in the contours of the ground, a silent testimony to the labor of the Crusader pilgrims who dug it with their own hands. The excavations that have been conducted at Château Pèlerin over the past century, by the French, the British, and the Israeli archaeologists who have worked at the site, have revealed the foundations of the Great Hall, the chapel, the barracks, and the workshops that were the living spaces of the garrison, and the artifacts that have been recovered, the pottery, the coins, the weapons, and the tools, provide a physical connection to the men who lived and died within the walls of the sea fortress. A connection that transcends the centuries and that brings the Templar garrison to life. The pottery that has been found at the site includes the locally produced wares that were used by the garrison for their daily meals, the simple bowls and jugs and cooking pots that were the utensils of the Templar kitchen, as well as the imported wares from Cyprus, Italy, and China that were the luxuries of the commander's table, the evidence of the trade routes that were the lifeblood of the Crusader economy. The coins that have been found at the site include the bezants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the gold coins that were the standard currency of the Crusader states, the silver dinars of the Ayyubid sultans that were taken as plunder in the Templar raids, and the florins of the Italian city-states that were the currency of the Mediterranean trade. A numismatic record of the economic connections that bound the fortress to the wider world. The weapons that have been found include the crossbow bolts, the iron heads of the quarrels that were the primary weapon of the garrison, the sword fragments that bear the marks of the battles that were fought on the walls, and the components of the Greek fire projectors that were the secret weapon of the Templar defense. The physical evidence of the military function of the fortress and of the violence that was the constant companion of the garrison's life. The artifacts of Château Pèlerin are a window into the daily life of the Templar garrison, a window that is slowly being opened by the patient work of the archaeologists, each new discovery adding a new piece to the puzzle of the impregnable sea fortress. The underwater archaeology of the harbor of Château Pèlerin has revealed the remains of the Templar ships that were sunk during the final evacuation of the fortress, the wrecks lying in the sand at the bottom of the harbor, their cargoes of stone catapult balls and iron arrowheads still in place, the artifacts that were lost when the ships were scuttled to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. The underwater excavations, which have been conducted by the Israeli marine archaeologists over the past decades and which are a field of study that is still in its infancy, have mapped the layout of the harbor and have recovered the artifacts that were lost when the ships went down, the pottery, the glass, and the metalwork that were the possessions of the brother sailors who manned the Templar fleet. The personal items that provide a glimpse into the lives of the men who sailed from the fortress. The most spectacular discovery that has been made in the harbor is the remains of the iron chain that protected the entrance, the massive links still lying on the seabed where they fell when the chain was cut during the evacuation, the chain that was the ultimate guarantee of the fortress's supply line and that was never broken by the enemy, the links being a tangible connection to the Templar naval power. The underwater archaeology of Château Pèlerin is a field of study that is still producing new discoveries, and each new season of excavation adds a new piece to the puzzle of the Templar maritime operations, the harbor of the sea fortress slowly yielding its secrets to the patient work of the archaeologists. The conservation of the ruins of Château Pèlerin is a challenge that is faced by the Israeli authorities who are responsible for the site. For the salt spray of the Mediterranean and the winter storms that batter the coast are a constant threat to the survival of the ancient stones, the salt crystallizing in the pores of the limestone and causing the surface to flake away. The stones slowly being consumed by the same sea that once protected the fortress. The walls of the fortress, which have stood for nearly 1,000 years and which have withstood the assaults of the Mamluk army and the erosion of the centuries, are now facing a new enemy. The climate change that is causing the sea level to rise and that is increasing the frequency and the intensity of the storms that batter the coast, the promontory being threatened by the very element that was once its greatest defense. The conservation efforts that are being undertaken by the Israeli authorities, in cooperation with the international archaeological community and with the support of the organizations that are dedicated to the preservation of the cultural heritage, are a race against time to preserve the ruins for the future generations. The conservators working to stabilize the walls and to protect them from the erosion of the sea. The site is now protected as a national park, and the visitors who walk the walls of the fortress are required to follow the designated paths, to avoid the damage that can be caused by the feet of the thousands of tourists who visit the site each year, the tourism being a double-edged sword that provides the funding for the conservation but that also threatens the ruins with the wear and tear of the human traffic. The conservation of Château Pèlerin is a labor of love for the archaeologists and the conservators who are dedicated to the preservation of the Templar legacy, and their work is a tribute to the warrior monks who built the fortress and who defended it through the centuries of the Crusader presence. The cultural significance of Château Pèlerin in the modern state of Israel, where the ruins of the fortress are a part of the historical landscape of the region, is a complex and layered matter, for the fortress is a part of the history of the land, a history that is claimed by multiple communities and that is interpreted through the lenses of the different national and religious traditions. The Jewish visitors to the site, who are the majority of the tourists and who come to the fortress as a part of their exploration of the history of the land, see the fortress as a part of the long history of the region, a history that includes the Canaanites, the Israelites, the Romans, the Crusaders, and the modern state of Israel, and the Templar castle is a chapter in that story. A chapter that is fascinating but that is not central to the Jewish narrative, which focuses on the periods of Jewish sovereignty and on the return to the land in the 20th century. The Christian visitors to the site, the pilgrims who come to the Holy Land to walk in the footsteps of the Crusaders and to visit the places that were defended by the warrior monks, see the fortress as a symbol of the Christian presence in the land, a presence that was ended by the Mamluk conquest but that is remembered in the stones of the castles and in the chronicles of the period. The Muslim visitors to the site, who are fewer in number but who are a part of the diverse population of the region, see the fortress as a part of the history of the Islamic conquest of the Holy Land, a conquest that was completed by the Mamluks and that was the end of the Crusader occupation, and the ruins of the fortress are a reminder of the defeat of the Franks and of the triumph of Islam. The cultural significance of Château Pèlerin is a reflection of the layered history of the Holy Land, a history that is written in the stones of the fortress and that continues to be contested and to be interpreted, the fortress being a symbol of the past that continues to speak to the present. The enduring fascination with Château Pèlerin in the popular imagination, from the novels and the films that have featured the castle to the video games that have allowed players to explore its digital reconstructions, is a testament to the power of the Templar legend and to the dramatic story of the impregnable sea fortress that defied the Mamluk Empire, and that was never taken by the enemy. A story that continues to captivate the imagination of the modern world. The castle, with its cyclopean walls and its deep fosse and its harbor chain, is an icon of the medieval world, a symbol of the fusion of monastic discipline and military power that was the Templar ideal, and the story of its final evacuation, the garrison marching to their ships with their treasure and their buisant while the fortress burned behind them, is a story of defiance and of honor that continues to inspire. The visitors who walk the walls of Château Pèlerin today are following in the footsteps of the Crusader pilgrims who built the fortress with their own hands, and they are keeping alive the memory of the Templar Leviathan that once ruled the coast of the Holy Land from its throne of stone and sea, a memory that will endure for as long as the stones still stand on the promontory. The fascination with Château Pèlerin is a part of the larger fascination with the Templar Order, a fascination that is rooted in the mystery and the legend of the warrior monks, and the fortress is the physical embodiment of that legend, a place that can be visited and touched, and that connects the visitor to the world of the Crusades. The strategic importance of Château Pèlerin in the defense of the Crusader states was a function of its location on the coast, its impregnable walls, and its harbor that could never be blockaded, a combination of factors that made the fortress the key to the Templar control of the coastal plain and the sea routes that were the lifeline of the Frankish presence in the Holy Land. The fortress was positioned at the midpoint of the Crusader coast, between the great port of Acre in the north and the city of Caesarea in the south, and its garrison could patrol the coastal road that was the artery of the Crusader communication and supply, preventing the Mamluk raiders from cutting the link between the coastal cities and from isolating the fortresses from each other. The harbor of Château Pèlerin, which was the base of the Templar fleet, allowed the order to control the sea lanes along the coast, escorting the supply convoys and intercepting the Muslim vessels that attempted to disrupt the Crusader trade, and the naval power that was projected from the fortress was a decisive factor in the prolonged survival of the Crusader states. For the coastal cities could not have been supplied without the ships that sailed from Château Pèlerin. The strategic importance of the fortress was recognized by the Templar Grand Masters, who made Château Pèlerin the headquarters of the order in the final decades of the Crusader presence, and who directed the defense of the kingdom from its walls, and by the Mamluk sultans, who were forced to bypass the fortress in their campaigns against the coastal cities, knowing that any assault on the sea castle would be a costly failure. Château Pèlerin was the keystone of the Templar defensive arch, and its survival was the guarantee of the Order's continued presence in the Holy Land, a presence that lasted until the final evacuation in 1291. The role of Château Pèlerin as the primary treasury of the Templar Order in the East was a function that was intimately connected to the fortress's strategic invincibility, for the gold and the silver that were stored in the vaults of the sea castle were the financial foundation of the Templar military operations, and the safety of the treasure was the guarantee of the Order's ability to wage war, to pay for the weapons and the provisions and the wages of the mercenaries that defended the Crusader states. The treasury of Château Pèlerin held the deposits of the kings, the barons, and the merchants who had entrusted their wealth to the Templar banking network, the gold bezants and the silver marks that were the currency of the Crusader economy, and that represented the savings of the faithful who had placed their trust in the order, and the treasure was the measure of the Templar economic power. A power that was the envy of the secular lords and that was the foundation of the order's independence from the kings and the popes. The treasury also held the accumulated wealth of the order itself, the donations and the bequests that had been given by the faithful over the centuries, the gold and the jewels and the precious metals that were the gifts of the pious and the spoils of the Templar raids, and the treasure was the fuel that powered the Templar war machine. The gold that was melted down and coined into the bezants that paid for the construction of the castles and the maintenance of the fleets. The safety of the treasury was a matter of constant concern for the Grand Masters, who knew that the loss of the treasure would be a crippling blow to the Order's military capability, a blow that could end the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, and the fortress of Château Pèlerin, with its cyclopean walls and its unbreakable harbor chain, was the ultimate guarantee of that safety. A guarantee that was never violated throughout the entire history of the Crusader states. The archive of the Templar Order, which was stored at Château Pèlerin alongside the treasury and which was the institutional memory of the temple, was a collection of documents that contained the records of the preceptories, the correspondence of the Grand Masters, and the secret documents that were the preserve of the initiated brothers, and its loss is one of the great tragedies of medieval scholarship. A loss that has left a void in our understanding of the inner workings of the most powerful military order of the Middle Ages. The archive was the repository of the accumulated knowledge of the order, the charters and the deeds that documented the Templar estates in Europe and the East, the letters that recorded the decisions of the Grand Masters and the instructions that were sent to the preceptories, and the ritual texts that were the esoteric tradition of the temple. The knowledge that was passed from master to apprentice, and that was never committed to writing except in the most secure of circumstances. The archive was lost when the order was suppressed in the early 14th century, the documents being seized by the agents of the French king and the Pope, and the records that were stored at Château Pèlerin and at the other Templar preceptories were destroyed or scattered. The loss of the archive being a deliberate act of cultural erasure that was intended to obliterate the memory of the order and to justify the persecution of the Templars. The archive of Château Pèlerin, which was the most important collection of Templar documents in the East, was burned by the brothers during the evacuation of the fortress in 1291, the flames consuming the parchment and the ink, and the smoke of the burning archive rising into the sky, a sacrifice that was made to deny the secrets to the enemy. A sacrifice that was the final act of the Templar guardians of the memory of the order. The loss of the Templar archive is a wound that can never be healed, and the scholars who study the order are forced to rely on the fragmentary records that survived the destruction, the chronicles of the other orders, and the archaeological evidence that continues to be uncovered at the sites of the Templar castles. The final evacuation of Château Pèlerin in August 1291 was an operation that was planned and executed with the same efficiency and the same discipline that characterized every aspect of the Templar military operations, the garrison loading the treasure, the archive, and the most precious of the chapel's relics onto the Templar ships under the cover of the night. Their movements hidden from the Mamluk scouts who watched the fortress from the mainland, the scouts who had been observing the castle for months and who reported to the Sultan that the garrison was still in place. The chronicler Templar of Tyre, who was present at the evacuation and who is the most reliable source for the events of that year, describes the scene as one of deliberate, orderly withdrawal, the brothers carrying the chests of gold and the bundles of documents to the waiting galleys, their faces illuminated by the flames of the buildings that they had set alight. The fire being the signal to the Mamluks that the fortress was being abandoned, but also the means of destroying the stores that could not be evacuated. The garrison had destroyed the interior of the castle before they left, the great hall and the barracks and the storerooms being consumed by the flames, to deny the use of the fortress to the Mamluks, and the Buzzant, the sacred black and white standard of the order, was carried to the flagship by the commander himself, the banner that had flown from the keep for over 7 decades being taken to the ship that would carry it to Cyprus. The standard being the symbol of the Templar presence in the Holy Land and the guarantee that the order would continue to fight. The ships slipped out of the harbor one by one, their sails filled with the night wind, and the fortress of Château Pèlerin, the impregnable sea castle that had defied the Mamluk Empire for over 7 decades, was left empty, the flames of the burning buildings reflecting on the water, a scene that was the end of the Templar presence in the Holy Land and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the order. The fate of Château Pèlerin after the Templar evacuation is a story that is briefly told, for the fortress was never reoccupied by the Crusaders, and the Mamluk sultans, who had no use for a sea fortress that they could not supply and that had been stripped of its treasure and its garrison, allowed it to fall into ruin, the walls slowly being eroded by the salt spray and the winter storms, and the harbor silting with the sand of the centuries, the sand that was carried by the currents and that filled the basin that had once sheltered the Templar fleet. The fortress was visited by the travelers and the pilgrims who passed along the coast, and its ruins were described by the chroniclers of the later Middle Ages as a wonder of the world, a place where the stones were too large to have been lifted by human hands and where the sea still guarded the empty walls, the legend of the impregnable sea castle growing with each retelling. The Ottoman Empire, which conquered the Holy Land in the 16th century and which absorbed the Mamluk territories, had no use for the fortress either, and the ruins were quarried for the stone that was used in the construction of the nearby towns and the bridges, the cyclopean blocks being broken into smaller pieces that could be transported by the carts and the sleds. The fortress that had been the most formidable in the Crusader East being slowly dismantled by the centuries, its stones scattered across the coastal plain. The memory of Château Pèlerin was preserved in the chronicles and in the legends that were told by the local population, but the physical fortress was gradually consumed by the sea and by the quarrymen, and by the 19th century, when the European scholars began to study the Crusader period, The site was a ruin that was barely recognizable as the Leviathan of the sea. The rediscovery of Château Pèlerin by the European scholars and the archaeologists of the 19th century was a moment of recognition, for the ruins that were described by the medieval chroniclers had been found, and the study of the fortress began the process of recovering the lost knowledge of the Templar military architecture, a process that continues to this day. The French archaeologist Emmanuel Guillaume, who visited the site in the 1850s and who was the first to systematically survey the ruins, was amazed by the size of the stone blocks and by the precision of the masonry, and his drawings and his descriptions of the fortress were the foundation of the modern understanding of the Templar engineering achievement, the first scientific study of the sea castle. The British archaeologists who worked at the site during the Mandate period, and the Israeli archaeologists who have continued the work since the establishment of the state, have added to the knowledge of the fortress, their excavations revealing the details of the construction and the successive occupations of the promontory, and their publications being the basis of the academic study of the Templar castles. The rediscovery of Château Pèlerin has allowed the modern world to appreciate the achievement of the Templar builders, and the ruins that are still standing on the promontory are a permanent monument to the warrior monks who built the Leviathan of the sea, a monument that can be visited and studied and that continues to reveal its secrets to the patient work of the archaeologists. The legacy of Château Pèlerin in the history of military architecture is a legacy that is written in the stone of the fortress and in the principles of defense that were pioneered by the Templar engineers and that were adopted by the builders of the later centuries. The principles of the concentric plan, the talus, the round towers, and the harbor chain that were the features of Château Pèlerin. These principles became the standard for the coastal fortresses of the Mediterranean, and their influence can be seen in the castles that were built by the Hospitallers at Rhodes and by the Venetians at Corfu and at Crete, the descendants of the Templar design that guarded the coasts of the Christian world against the Ottoman Empire. The Cyclopean walls of Château Pèlerin, the massive stone blocks that were the signature of the fortress, were a declaration that the Templars had mastered the art of military construction, a declaration that was understood by the enemies who confronted the fortress and by the allies who were inspired by its example, and the fortress became a model for the coastal defenses that would be built in the centuries that followed. The legacy of Château Pèlerin is the legacy of the Templar order itself, a legacy of innovation, of discipline, and of an unbreakable will that was written in the stone of the sea castle and that continues to inspire the generations who visit the ruins and who study the history of the warrior monks. A legacy that will endure for as long as the stones still stand on the promontory. The legend of Château Pèlerin, which grew in the centuries after the Templar evacuation and which was nourished by the stories of the chroniclers and the imaginations of the poets, is a story that is woven from the threads of the historical record and the fabric of the popular imagination, a story that has been told and retold by the scholars, the novelists, and the filmmakers who have been captivated by the image of the impregnable sea fortress. The legend of the Cyclopean walls, the stones that were too large to have been lifted by human hands and that must have been set in place by the magic of the demons or the power of the divine, is a legend that was first recorded by the Muslim chroniclers who witnessed the construction of the fortress, and who were convinced that the Templars had employed the supernatural to raise the walls. A conviction that was reinforced by the failure of every attempt to breach them. The legend of the harbor chain, the massive iron barrier that protected the entrance to the harbor, and that was never broken by the enemy, is a legend that was celebrated by the Templar chroniclers and that was remembered by the sailors who plied the waters of the coast, a symbol of the Templar mastery of the sea and of the invincibility of the fortress that they called their home. The legend of the final evacuation, the garrison marching to their ships with their treasure and their buisant while the fortress burned behind them, is a legend that was recorded by the chronicler Templar of Tyre and that has been retold in the histories and the novels of the later centuries. A story of defiance and of honor that has become a part of the Templar myth, and that continues to inspire the modern imagination. The legends of Château Pèlerin are a part of the cultural heritage of the Crusader period, and they continue to captivate the minds of those who hear them, the stories being a bridge between the medieval world and the present. The influence of Château Pèlerin on the later Templar castles and on the military architecture of the Mediterranean is a chapter of the fortress's story that extends beyond the fall of the Crusader states. For the design of the sea castle was studied and imitated by the Templar engineers who constructed the subsequent fortresses. and its principles were adopted by the other military orders and by the secular powers of the region, the fortress becoming a model for the coastal defenses of the Mediterranean. The Castle of Tortosa, which was built on the Syrian coast and which served as the Templar headquarters in the north, incorporated the same cyclopean walls, the same talus, and the same harbor defenses that had been pioneered at Atlit, the Templar engineers applying the lessons of the sea castle to the new fortress, and creating a citadel that was the equal of Château Pèlerin in its strength and its strategic importance. The Hospitallers, who were the rivals and the allies of the Templars and who were the other great military order of the Crusader period, studied the design of Château Pèlerin and incorporated its features into their own coastal fortresses, the Castle of Rhodes being a direct descendant of the Templar sea castle, its walls and its harbor defenses reflecting the influence of the Atlit model. The influence of Château Pèlerin extended beyond the Crusader period, for the coastal fortresses that were built by the Venetians, the Genoese, and the Ottomans in the centuries that followed were the heirs of the Templar design, their walls and their harbors owing a debt to the Leviathan of the sea, and the principles that were pioneered at Château Pèlerin became a permanent part of the art of military architecture. The cultural memory of Château Pèlerin in the modern state of Israel, where the ruins of the fortress are a national park and a place of pilgrimage for the tourists and the scholars, is a memory that is shaped by the complex and the layered history of the region, a history that is contested by the different communities that claim the land and that is interpreted through the lenses of the different national and religious narratives. The Israeli visitors to the site, who are the majority of the tourists and who come to the fortress as a part of their exploration of the history of the land, see the fortress as a part of the long history of the region, a history that includes the Canaanites, the Israelites, the Romans, the Crusaders, and the modern state, and the Templar castle is a chapter in that story. A chapter that is fascinating but that is not central to the Jewish narrative, which focuses on the periods of Jewish sovereignty and on the return to the land in the 20th century. The Arab visitors to the site, who are fewer in number but who are a part of the diverse population of the region, see the fortress as a part of the history of the Islamic conquest of the Holy Land, a conquest that was completed by the Mamluks and that was the end of the Crusader occupation, and the ruins of the fortress are a reminder of the defeat of the Franks and of the triumph of Islam. A reminder that the land was eventually reclaimed by the Muslim powers. The international visitors to the site, the tourists who come from Europe and from America and who are drawn by the legend of the Templars, see the fortress as a part of the medieval history of the Holy Land, a history that is fascinating in its own right, and that is the subject of the books and the films that have popularized the Templar story. And the ruins of Château Pèlerin are a place where they can connect with that history. The cultural memory of Château Pèlerin is a reflection of the diversity of the perspectives that are brought to the interpretation of the Crusader period, and the fortress is a symbol of the contested history of the Holy Land, a history that is written in the stones and that continues to be debated. The archaeological future of Château Pèlerin is a subject of excitement and of anticipation among the scholars who study the Templar period, for the site has not yet been fully excavated, and the areas that have been explored have yielded a wealth of artifacts and of information that have transformed the understanding of the Templar fortress and of the daily life of its garrison. The underwater archaeology of the harbor, which is a field that is still in its infancy and that has the potential to reveal the remains of the Templar ships that were sunk during the final evacuation, is a priority for the Israeli marine archaeologists who are responsible for the site, and the excavation of the harbor may uncover the wrecks of the galleys and the supply vessels that were scuttled, the artifacts that were lost when the ships went down, and the remains of the harbor chain that was the ultimate guarantee of the fortress's supply. The terrestrial archaeology of the fortress, which has been focused on the outer ward and the barbican, has yet to fully explore the inner ward and the keep, the areas where the treasury and the archive were located and where the most precious of the Templar possessions were stored, and the excavation of these areas may reveal the secrets that were lost when the archive was burned. The artifacts and the inscriptions that could illuminate the inner life of the Templar order, and that could provide the answers to the questions that have puzzled the historians for centuries. The future of the archaeological research at Château Pèlerin is bright, and the discoveries that will be made in the coming decades will add new chapters to the story of the impregnable sea fortress, chapters that will be written by the patient work of the excavators, and that will be read by the generations of scholars and enthusiasts who follow. The preservation of Château Pèlerin for the future generations is a challenge that requires the cooperation of the Israeli authorities, the international archaeological community, and the public that visits the site. For the fortress is a fragile monument that is threatened by the elements, and by the impact of the tourism that is essential to the funding of the conservation efforts, but that also poses a risk to the ancient stones. The salt spray of the Mediterranean, the winter storms that batter the coast, and the rise of the sea level that is a consequence of the climate change are all threats to the survival of the ruins, and the conservation of the site requires a continuous investment of the resources that are often scarce in a region that is plagued by the political and the military conflicts. The resources being diverted to the pressing needs of the present rather than to the preservation of the past. The visitors to the site, whose numbers are increasing as the Templar legend grows in the popular imagination and as the fortress becomes a must-see destination for the tourists who visit the Holy Land, must be educated about the fragility of the ruins and about the importance of preserving them for the future, a task that is the responsibility of the park authorities and of the guides who lead the tours of the fortress. The guides telling the story of the Templar garrison and reminding the visitors that the stones they walk on are the same stones that were laid by the Crusader pilgrims. The preservation of Château Pèlerin is a labor of love for the archaeologists and the conservators who are dedicated to the protection of the Templar legacy, and their work is a tribute to the warrior monks who built the Leviathan of the sea, a tribute that will ensure that the fortress continues to stand for the generations to come. Architecture, a genius that was the product of the fusion of the European, the Armenian, and the Byzantine traditions, and it was the symbol of the Templar determination to defend the Holy Land at any cost, a determination that was the foundation of the order's identity. The fortress was never captured by the enemy, and its garrison was never forced to surrender, a record that is unique among the castles of the Crusader states, and that is a testament to the skill of the Templar engineers and the courage of the Templar brothers, a record that was the pride of the order and the despair of its enemies. The evacuation of the fortress, the garrison marching to their ships with their treasure and their basalt while the fortress burned behind them, was a final act of defiance that encapsulated the Templar spirit, a spirit that refused to admit defeat even when the cause was lost, and that chose destruction over surrender, a choice that was the ultimate expression of the Templar ethos. The significance of Château Pèlerin is the significance of the Templar order itself, a significance that is written in the stone of the sea castle and that will endure for as long as the ruins still stand on the promontory, a significance that is a part of the heritage of the medieval world and that continues to speak to the present. We have journeyed to the coast of the Holy Land, to the rocky promontory that juts into the Mediterranean Sea, and we have walked the cyclopean walls of Château Pèlerin, the impregnable sea fortress that was the greatest achievement of the Templar military engineers and the ultimate refuge of the warrior monks in the east. We have marveled at the massive stone blocks, the cyclopean stones that were laid by the Crusader pilgrims with their own hands, and we have traced the line of the talus that deflected the stones of the trebuchets and the waves of the winter storms, the talus that was the shield of the fortress. We have explored the barbican and the double walls that created the killing ground, the gate system that was the most sophisticated of the Crusader period, and the fosse that cut the fortress off from the mainland and turned it into an island of stone, a fortress that was protected by the sea on 3 sides and by the courage of its garrison on the 4th. We have gazed into the harbor where the Templar fleet lay at anchor, the harbor that was protected by the massive iron chain that was never broken, and we have imagined the supply ships that sailed from Cyprus and Italy, their holds filled with the grain and the wine and the weapons that sustained the garrison through the long years of the Mamluk siege, the ships that were the lifeline of the fortress. We have felt the presence of the treasury and the archive, the gold and the records that were the lifeblood of the order, stored in the vaults of the inner ward under the constant guard of the brothers who had sworn to defend them with their lives, the treasure that was the foundation of the Templar power, and the archive that was the memory of the temple. And we have witnessed the final, defiant act of the garrison in 1291, the evacuation of the fortress under the cover of the night, the flames of the burning buildings rising into the sky, and the ships sailing away to Cyprus with the basalt flying from the masts, the sacred standard that was the symbol of the Templar presence in the Holy Land and that was carried to the new refuge of the order. Château Pèlerin was never captured, never surrendered, and its story is the story of the Templar spirit at its most indomitable, a spirit that refused to yield even when the cause was lost. The legacy of Château Pèlerin is not merely the ruins that still stand on the coast of Israel, the massive stones that are slowly being reclaimed by the sea and that are a silent testimony to the achievement of the Templar builders, for the fortress was the model for the coastal defenses that would be built by the military orders and by the secular powers in the centuries that followed. And its influence can be traced in the fortresses that guard the coasts of the Mediterranean to this day. The concentric plan, the talus, the round towers, and the harbor chain that were pioneered at Château Pèlerin became the standard features of the Mediterranean fortress, and their principles were applied to the castles of Rhodes, of Corfu, and of Malta, the island fortresses that were the bulwarks of Christendom against the Ottoman Empire and that were the descendants of the Templar sea castle. The significance of Château Pèlerin in the history of the Templar order is a significance that is both military and symbolic, for the fortress was the ultimate expression of the Templar genius for military. The Templar engineers who built Château Pèlerin were the founders of a tradition of coastal fortification that endured for centuries. A tradition that was the basis of the European maritime power, and that was a factor in the rise of the West, the ability to project power across the seas and to defend the coastal strongholds that were the nodes of the global trade. The stones of Château Pèlerin, quarried by the Crusader pilgrims and laid by the Templar masons, are the foundation of a legacy that extends far beyond the Crusader period, a legacy that is a permanent contribution to the art of military architecture, and that is a part of the heritage of the Western world. The human dimension of Château Pèlerin, the story of the men who lived and died within its walls, is the heart of the fortress's history, for the walls and the towers were nothing without the brothers who manned them, the knights and the sergeants and the sailors who gave their lives to the defense of the Holy Land and whose names are mostly lost to history but whose courage and whose devotion are remembered in the chronicles. The daily rhythm of prayer and work, the long watches on the walls and the patrols through the coastal plain, the loading and the unloading of the supply ships, and the maintenance of the weapons and the armor were the fabric of the garrison's life, a life that was lived in the constant shadow of the Mamluk threat, but that was sustained by the faith and the discipline that were the foundation of the Templar vocation. The brothers who served at Château Pèlerin were the guardians of the temple's most precious possessions, the treasury and the archive that were stored in the vaults of the inner ward, and they were the sentinels of the sea, the men who watched the horizon for the approach of the enemy and who kept the harbor chain raised against the intrusion of the hostile galleys. Their vigilance being the final line of defense for the treasure and the secrets of the order. The garrison of Château Pèlerin was a community of warrior monks whose devotion to the order was absolute, and their story is a story of courage and of fidelity that deserves to be remembered, a story that is a part of the larger story of the Templar order, and that is a testament to the human spirit. The tragedy of the Crusader states, the slow, grinding collapse of the Frankish presence in the Holy Land under the pressure of the Mamluk advance, is a tragedy that Château Pèlerin survived to the very end, the fortress being a rock of stability in a sea of chaos, a place of refuge and of resistance that outlasted every other stronghold on the mainland. The fall of Acre in May 1291, the final catastrophe that extinguished the Crusader presence on the mainland and that sent the survivors fleeing to the ships, was followed by the evacuation of Château Pèlerin in August of the same year, the garrison sailing away from the burning fortress and leaving the Holy Land to the enemy. The flames of the burning buildings being the last sight that they had of the land they had sworn to defend. The fortress that had been the impregnable sea castle, the Leviathan that had defied the Mamluk Empire for over 7 decades, was abandoned, not because it had been defeated, but because the cause that it had served was lost, and the brothers who sailed away to Cyprus carried with them the treasure and the memory of the order, the legacy of the warrior monks who had built the greatest fortresses of the medieval world. The end of Château Pèlerin was the end of the Templar presence in the Holy Land, and it was a moment of tragedy and of glory, a moment that is preserved in the chronicles and in the stones of the fortress, a moment that marks the transition from the Crusader period to the new world that would emerge from the ashes of the Frankish kingdom. The memory of Château Pèlerin, preserved in the ruins that still stand on the coast of Israel and in the pages of the chroniclers who recorded the history of the Crusader states, is a treasure that has been passed down to us across the centuries, and it is a memory that we are privileged to share. A memory that connects us to the Crusader pilgrims who built the walls with their own hands and to the Templar brothers who defended them with their lives. The fortress that was the Leviathan of the sea is gone, its walls broken by the centuries and its harbor silted with the sand, but its story remains, a story of ambition, of ingenuity, and of defiance that continues to inspire and to move, a story that is the legacy of the warrior monks who built the impregnable sea castle. The promontory of Atlit, which was the throne of the Templar power on the coast, is now a place of peace, a place where the sea birds cry and the wind blows through the ruins, and the cyclopean stones that still stand on the edge of the water are a silent testament to the men who built them, the men who gave their lives for the defense of the Holy Land. The Leviathan of the sea is a memory, but it is a memory that will never die, for it is written in the stones of the promontory, and in the hearts of all who love the history of the warrior monks, a history that is the legacy of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. If the story of Château Pèlerin, the impregnable sea fortress that defied the Mamluk Empire and that was never taken by the enemy, has stirred your spirit and awakened your curiosity about the lost fortresses of the Templars, then I ask you now to become a part of our fellowship, a fellowship that is dedicated to the preservation of the memory of the warrior monks and to the exploration of the medieval world. Strike that like button with the force of a wave crashing against the talus of Atlit, and subscribe to Stories of Our History with the bell notification fully armed, so that you will sail with us on every new expedition into the past, every new journey into the lost world of the Crusades. Your comments are the harbor chain that protects our community. Tell me below what other Templar fortresses you would like to see explored in this depth, and share your thoughts on the final, defiant evacuation of the garrison, the brothers marching to their ships while the fortress burned behind them. Share this video with your friends and your family, and help us to build a community of history lovers that is worthy of the Crusader pilgrims who built the walls of Château Pèlerin with their own hands, a community that will keep the memory of the Templar Leviathan alive for the generations to come. Together, we can reach our goal of 1,000 likes and ensure that the story of the impregnable sea fortress is told and retold, a story that will inspire the future as it has inspired the past. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.